Okay, good morning. Good morning, everyone. It seems that we are online. So I'm Paolo Foggi, I'm the chair of the Scientific Advice Working Party. I will thank you for joining us on this day 2 of this EMA multi-stakeholder workshop on the qualification of novel methodologies. First of all, let me thank the chair, speakers, and panelists, and all who contributed to yesterday's sessions that were really valuable. We got numerous input of the important aspects we consider for optimizing and promoting the qualification framework. And coming to today's work, we will start with another session looking at the case examples, following yesterday's session in which we focused on PROs, modeling, simulation, digital health technologies, and artificial intelligence, machine learning. This first session will be focused on real-world evidence and qualification of data sources. Then we will have a final session in which we will discuss together ways to optimize the qualification framework with the help of panelists representing the viewpoint of different stakeholders. So looking forward to another very interesting and productive day of work together. In the interest of time, I lead the floor to the chair. So the first session, real-world evidence and qualification of data sources. So let me welcome Peter Moore, which is Senior Assessor from Dutch Medicine Evaluation Board, Professor of Drug Regulatory Science at University Medical Center Groningen, and also member of the EMA Scientific Advice Working Party, and Juan Jose Abellan Andres, which is a Biostatistics and Real-World Evidence Senior Specialist at Data Analytics and Method Task Force at the EMA. So, Peter, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paolo, and it's a pleasure to be able to both chair today and especially with Juanjo to do that. We will have first 3 speakers introducing the topic, and I will be in the pleasant position to do that myself, to talk about registries and in terms of the qualification process. We will give different perspectives on that. And then we will introduce the panelists who will give short reflections, and then I hope it's up to you, the public, also to give us input on the burning questions around qualifying registries for regulatory purposes. So Juanjo, maybe you can go into a little bit of the housekeeping rules, and then we'll kick off further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Yes, just to remind everyone that this workshop is being recorded, and the Slido facility will be used to pose questions, to also vote on those questions that are the more relevant by the audience. So please do not type your questions in the chat of this WebEx meeting, but do that on the Slido. And as Peter said, we're looking forward to the first 3 presentations, sharing the regulatory perspective as well as the respective experiences from 2 registries that underwent the qualification process, and to follow by a discussion. We would like to hear the feedback and the thoughts of everyone, so that we can actually improve ultimately the process of qualification of real-world data sources. And I think without any further ado, we can start maybe with the first presentation by Professor Peter Moll. Peter is a professor of drug regulatory science at the Department of Clinical Pharmacy and Pharmacology at the University Medical Center in Groningen. And he's also senior assessor at the Dutch Medicines Evaluation Board and member of the EMA Scientific Advice Working Party. And he's going to provide a regulatory perspective on qualification of data sources. So Peter, when you are ready, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Juanjo. Everybody knows now who I am, I believe. So maybe we can move to the next slide, please. We will talk about registries as a sort of as a form of the real world data, and as is written in this kind of visionary paper by colleagues of the EMA. The idea is that we will be using this real world data and have given it a place in, let's say, in our decision-making process from at least from 2025 onwards. And I think that is where I will talk about how can registries fill in that spot at least. Can we have the next slide? Can I have yeah. So in 2016, 2015, we started with the EMA patient registry initiative because our experience with registries and their use in regulatory decision making wasn't always as successful. They didn't deliver the data that we needed, not in the right time, or not as much recruitment as we had anticipated. And also, we didn't talk as regulators with the people owning the registries or setting up the registries. We talked to the industry. The industry then talked to the registry owners, and we had this broken triangle, as we call it. And I think we saw that also yesterday, where regulators didn't talk with all the right stakeholders at the right time. We also addressed in that initiative the registry versus the as a data source, as a collection of information, versus the registry study, the study performed in the registry. And that is the one that the regulator is most interested in, because that is answering the question that is at hand, be it safety, be it more on effectiveness or anything else. And I will go into that. On the right-hand side, you see the nice front page of the thesis of Carla Jonker, who was a colleague at the Dutch Medicines Evaluation Board, and she was a PhD student and has moved partly to the EMA now, who has really worked and done experiments and also looked at the value of the registries. And her point is that for rare disease cases, it is really a must for decision making. And I will go into that a little bit more, why and how that can be done. Next slide. But let's go first to that landscape, because there are not one or two registries in every disease area. No, there can be hundreds. Here there is a mapping of real-world data sources for heart failure patients. There were 322 identified. And we are regulators of medicines, drug codes were only really recorded in 10% of those data sets. Caregiver involvement was poorly reported, and only few sources also gave information access to data to others than the registry owners themselves. So that is really giving you an impression there may be a lot of data, but it may not always generate the information that we need. Next slide. So that patient registry initiative was really there to bring people together and really understand how can we improve that. And how did the EMA do that then? Well, next slide. We wanted to mend that broken triangle, as I said. So the patient data is there, but we want the regulator to talk also to the registry owner and get more reasonable expectations on all sides on what data can be collected, what data are needed to be collected, and which are the nice to haves and the needs to haves. And again, we also talked a little bit about the data source versus the study performed in that registry data set. Next slide. This is the time scale we were on. There was a lot of work had already been done around registries and identification of registries to the parent initiative, a joint action initiative. We obviously looked at, okay, what is already known about registries, so various background studies, what was the role in the regulatory decision making. As said, that was not always optimal. But most importantly, we organized workshops with different stakeholders around a number of disease areas: cystic fibrosis, multiple sclerosis, CAR T cells, hemophilia. And there were at that time also 2 qualification procedures in this time span of the ECFSPR, and we will hear more about that, EBMT, and I will get into a little bit more detail hereafter. Next slide, please. So these registries and these workshops were held consecutively, and they discussed each time with a broad group of stakeholders aspects of how data should be collected, what data should be collected, how this data quality would be governed, and also how would it be maintained. And this paper by Patricia McGettigan was published in Drug Safety, really reflecting on what we did in those workshops. And it gives you a practical handle on what regulators may expect of this kind of information. Next slide, please. Another workshop that was held just after these workshops were done was a specific one where we look at cancer therapies, specifically in genetic and molecular feature with rare genotyping also on those molecular features. And that is something that we need to have this kind of data because we're increasingly relying also on single-arm trials supporting applications. And we obviously would like to know how these patients fare in common practice or in daily practice. Next slide. So what have we really learned during those meetings? So first of all, the core common data elements. And that was a real important eye-opener, I believe. The distinction between must-have and nice-to-have. So what are the data that we really need to have to understand the progression of the disease of the patient, but also what the drugs are doing to these patients? Then there are many aspects which we would like to collect additionally, but always with in mind having that if you ask for more, this also would increase the workload and risks that the data quality will be lower. Next slide. Data quality is clearly something that is on the mind of the regulator. We are very used to seeing trial data, very well curated, very well documented, and important because the drug effects may be not always that outspoken. You need to have good quality data, but for real world data, perhaps slightly different and to different levels. But consistency, completeness, accuracy, and also the availability in time, the timeliness is important. So there should be really clarity on what these are. So these aspects of quality may be at a slightly different level than for trials, but they need to be very well documented. The same applies to source data verification. And this has become increasingly clear from these meetings what could be expected, and that might, on all sides of these stakeholders, a different kind of viewpoints on how you operationalize that. Next slide. So the governance is important in the sense that obviously data should be collected according to the regulations that GDPR is adhered to, that also must be possible to sometimes approach the individual data because we need to understand, for instance, a serious safety event and that needs to be described. So there may be additional questions on that, but also the registry holder should be ready to have this interaction both with industry and, if needed, with regulators once the studies are performed using their data. So that should be clear on how this is access, sharing, and publication of the data should be clear also. Next slide. So then today there is methodological guidance in the meantime, especially the registry-based studies guideline from the EMA is something that I would recommend you to read up clearly. And I will go into that slightly more a bit later on, but also the guidance for collecting and reporting adverse drug events. The qualification procedure obviously is what is the topic of today, and on the next slide, I'm referring to that methodological guidance, and if you has been published during the COVID period, we were very working hard on this because we believe there was a large need to that understanding. So the next slide gives you then the table of content, and if you press once more, you would see that what is important here in this guideline, it's not on registries, it's on the registry-based studies. And that is an important aspect because this is what we can really ask for as regulators. Next slide. What we then, of course, realize that patient registries that are where these studies are being performed in also would like to see some guidance what regulators expect when they are set up. And that is also described, but more in the annex, because it's not immediately within the remit of the regulator to define what should be collected in a patient registry. It's not always on medicines. Next slide. And important, I think, is also the aspect, because we are looking at safety of medicines, especially many of the registries will be following patients after the drug has been approved, and will have a particular interest in safety. If these data are collected as and used as secondary data, collected in general and maybe used for a study thereafter, this appendix gives you a clear overview what is now expected in terms of reporting, an issue that often came up and is perceived as a kind of quite complex topic within collecting and also performing safe registry-based studies. Next slide. So back to the qualification. What are we as regulators now doing when a registry comes to the EMA and look at that registry proposal? Well, the benefits of these qualifications are clearly that next time when a company would come, for instance, well, we are going to perform our registry, our post-approval safety study in this and this registry, and it is qualified, and we have at least an understanding that this may be the one that we feel comfortable with. Next slide. And from at the moment, we see various numbers of registries coming for qualification advisor or qualification opinion. Qualification advisor, I think for most of you in the meantime, clear that this is okay. This is what you still need to do to get qualified and endorsed for specific use from the regulator perspective. And here there are 3 registries currently approved or qualified, and you can read up for what purposes. There are 2 registries already with a public letter of support also on the website, but we've spoken with many more registries that are on the way to become a registry that can be used in different studies. Next slide, please. And important, what do we then see in those qualification procedures? Well, the majority of the proposals focuses around post-authorization safety studies. I will make later a case that you can also use them actually for other uses. We discussed data quality, the source data verification, and how is that guaranteed? So not per se the level. On the right-hand side, you see a survey that we have performed where we asked different stakeholders, industry and other stakeholders, whether or not and what amount of source data verification they would feel comfortable with. That is set here at 30%, but is that really the level that we want to, that needs to be just validated, justified by the applicant, by the registry owner. The data elements are clearly important, the needs to have and the nice to have. And I think one aspect that will always come back is the discussion around the co-medication and the safety data. We are medicines regulators, so we're particularly interested in that. So if data linkage to, for instance, co-medication is a possibility, that is a definite benefit. If safety data are collected in a structured way, or also investigators are being alerted to, okay, if you see an adverse event, a serious adverse event, please also report that to the vigilance centers. That are kind of comments and aspects that are very important. The access to individual patient data may be needed in specific cases. For instance, if there is a serious adverse event that needs to be described, a new one. It is not always obligatory for every kind of study, but it may be needed to understand specific aspects. The proof of concept study is something that is being... Okay, I will be wrapping up. So the proof of concept is, I think, an important aspect, looking at feasibility and missingness. Questions a little bit on if we have a registry that is already well established versus the ones with that have the idea of starting to collect information, but where no data are. So then we need to have that discussion on, okay, will you ultimately be able to perform that study? I wanted to go, and I will make that in very brief then. Next slide. The quick link to the Darwin EU Center, the data set that the EMA in the meantime has access to, a federated data set, mostly from electronic health records, but for instance also biobanks where you can ask questions and the registries could be adding information. The next slide will give you then where the areas, and this is what I want to highlight also here today, is that these studies aren't only focused on safety, but we can also look at the planning of the trial. So the design feasibility of trials that are going to be performed, looking at representativeness may be a very useful kind of area for the regulator also. And these types of studies may be performed with registries. Next slide. Again, registries aren't the only set of data. Trials aren't the only set of data we're using, but it may also be in continuum. And if you press once more, one very important kind of development, click please, is that I believe that studies and trials may increasingly be also performed in registries. And then you get a sort of blend of real-world data and registries. Next slide will give you then some of my academic work where we try to integrate and blend real-world data with RCT data, using patient registries to explore in the field of heart failure, multiple sclerosis, and lung cancer ways of using this data and strengthening the trial data. So the final slide, the next one. Evidentiary standards for regulators do not change. Evidence may be derived, though, from multiple data sources. While electronic health records show great promise, I believe that patient registries do have really added value. Especially the more structured data collection, the PROs that can be brought into that, also by patients sometimes directly, very important. But with qualifications, please also mind that we have to be very clear. What are the data that can be collected? Which are the need-to-haves? What is the timeliness? What will be the access for the regulator? And do we have a good idea of the recruitment and feasibility of the registry-based studies that will be performed in these with these registries? So here I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for providing the regulatory perspective on the usefulness and of real-world data and the importance of qualifying such data sources. Please remind everyone to have your comments ready to be posted on Slido. The code for Slido will be shared after the presentations so that everyone can access Slido and post your comments and questions there. Thank you. We move on to the next presentation by Professor Lutz Nerlich. I hope I have pronounced your name correctly. So Professor Nerlich is a pediatric pulmonologist at the University of Gießen in Germany and medical lead of the German Cystic Fibrosis. As past director of the European Cystic Fibrosis Society Patient Registry, he participated in the qualification process and serves currently as pharmacovigilance study manager for the European Cystic Fibrosis Society Patient Registry. So Lutz, when you're ready, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you for the kind introduction and the opportunity to share our experience with the qualification process. Next slide, please. To give you a short overview about the European Cystic Fibrosis Society Patient Registry, we have to explain that this was funded in 2003 by the European Cystic Fibrosis Society, which is not a foundation. It's a society of caregivers across Europe. And one of the aims was to collect the data, to compare CF care, but also therapies and outcome across Europe. And the definition I think we choose from the society was the WHO region of Europe. So I think expanding it a little bit more to other regions like Israel or the East. The main stakeholders from the beginning were the clinicians who want to answer the question, where are we standing? How to compare our data with other countries? What can be improved? The patient, I think, to give them back, I think, the data, I think, and to show where are they standing. The researchers who want to see, for example, rare events across Europe. And last but not least, from the beginning, the health authorities was also taken into account, but that was one of the options for the future. Next slide, please. In 2021, 54,000 patients from all the 40 countries were collected, and we have to have in mind that there are 70 national registries, like, for example, the German CF registries, who collect the data on their own. And the European Cystic Fibrosis Registry is collecting data from the countries who do not have a collection platform and also from the national registries. And to have an output across Europe from one annual data report every year, 1.5 years after the data calendar year, and mainly scientific publications. It's a wide range of countries, and we are very happy to see that the coverage is more than 80% in nearly all the countries, because I think there's a deep commitment to really show the data and to compare the data. Next slide. What was the keys to success for this? I think from the beginning, I think the harmonization of the data set is one of the essential points, because there are slight deviations from the beginning, but I think to compare data, you need a harmonized data set, and everyone has to step back a little bit to really focus on the common goal to prescribe the data in one way. The quality control is very essential on a center level to trust the data, to show the data, to share data, I think even in a research community. And this needs a clear governance, for example, that we say that the countries are the data owners and the centers, and that with the data, except the annual report, for each scientific publication, we have to go back to the countries to say, are you allowing us to share the data? And that everything is based on an informed consent according to GDPR. Sustainability, over 20 years to run a registry without large resources, it's mainly based on commitment, and have to keep that spirit up. Transparency, access to the data, and independency from industry was from the beginning one of the key goals. Next slide. In 2016, we were very happy to be approached, I think, to take part in this discussion as a model for other rare diseases. And in 2017, a workshop on CF registries, as mentioned by Peter, was established. And in 2018, followed by the qualification opinion by the EMA. The first applications for pharmacovigilance studies came in 2019. Next slide. The workshop, as Peter mentioned, was very essential for us, because this registry was not built up only for pharmacovigilance reasons. I think it was just one of the aspects. So to really discuss with the medical authorization holders, the EMA, patient representatives, and us, I think, about the governance, the informed consent, the data protection, and the data sharing with all the different parties. The process of data upload, data elements, and data quality was a very essential part of this discussion to really reassure, are we fit enough? Are we dealing, could we take the opportunity and the obligations? Next slide. And it came out that I think it was very critical to have a direct communication to the public domain, to explain also and to reassure the patient that their data are in a safe harbor and would be used in their best interest to show the safety and efficacy of new drugs, I think, and to share this to a public domain like the EMA and also in between the medical authorization holders. And to establish a central contact point for Europe, because companies in the US have access to a large amount of patients, I think, in one country under one umbrella, and here 40 countries, very small, very large. This needs a very central contact point for industry to really make that happen. The informed consent was, as Peter mentioned, very essential, because we see it as a secondary use of registry data, which is covered by our basic informed consent, like every research request, because we take safety and efficacy in our initial template and in all the individual national informed consent processes. And not to go for a separate informed consent, like for a registry study, I think, which might be a little bit enriched by other variables. And to share aggregated data. This is very essential, especially in rare diseases, where the anonymization of patients is difficult to the genotype, which is very special or unique even for patients, and to re-identify patient as a high risk. So the patient's interest was very important. The data quality, completeness and accuracy, but also source data verification, which was out of our scope due to the resources at that time and was even started to think about that. And the data elements, the registry description, the annual data set, which is a backbone of our registry world, the disease-specific complications and medications, in contrast to a clinical study where you collect all adverse events or all other medications, which is out of our possibilities at that time, and to really reassure that this can address the questions quite very well, because we are also interested in new complications or safety aspects which come up with the new trials and drugs, and we will introduce them also to our data set and can be used for secondary use of data. Next slide, please. The triangle discussion was extremely helpful and critical for us to really reassure are we ready to take that obligation. The clarification of limitation and challenges, the governance, the data quality, and as Peter Mohl mentioned, the guidelines which were published later, I think is very helpful for other registry, and also the checklist, the request tool gives a good overview about the single criteria which are very important here. Next slide. For us, I think the qualification process itself was quite very smooth after that workshop, because we know a little bit more about the different perspectives, but the framework for the registries has to be established from the scratch. It was a clear, strict and direct and very good communication. I think the process was very clear. For a large consortium like the ECSFPR, which is not professionalized at that level like the industry partners, the timelines were extremely challenged. And the structure with the questions and background to really come up with a question, I think, was not so easy for us. And the short timelines are a challenge. Next slide. So we would like to address, I think, and I see that in upcoming other applications and our qualifications opinion, a structured description in addition to the questions and answer section is a very helpful one also for other registries to understand on which level the qualified partners are. The issues, I think, of the short timelines need sometimes a clock stop to really get such a large network of countries or contributors to align with these obligations and to fit the answers. Next slide, please. Our experience after the qualifications opinions was quite it was a breakthrough and a milestone. The reputation inside the ECSF was also running a clinical trial network and a standards of care project was very exciting, and also outside. The commitment to work on the EMA's requirements were very important and is a continuous goal. The resources to close the gap between commitment and demands are very challenging for us at the beginning, I think, and to keep the balance between the core business, which is mainly based on the commitment, and not on focusing only on the pharmacovigilance studies, because we know if a period is over, I think we have to go back to the usual business, I think, and we want to see the CF registry in the 30s and the next century. The pharmacovigilance requests we get were two. One of the drug utilization of an orphan drug across 40 countries, so taking advantage of the whole package, I think, from 2022 to 2024, which is cited within the oil pass, and an efficacy study on an orphan drug and a specific age group, including 11 countries, highlighting the importance of aggregating data from different countries under a harmonized data set to get the real number, to get a good real-world evidence. That is based on the similar outcome of the countries and the patients in this country. Next slide. The post-qualification process was quite a little bit different, I think. The triangle discussion, which was very useful in the workshop and also in the qualification opinion, I think it lacks a little bit afterwards, and the medical authorization holder was very keen to have the main contact to the EMA, and we are losing a little bit the active communication, which is important, and we are depending on the indirect feedback and the indirect involvement of the registry. A direct feedback on the methodology, and we are living and developing a registry over time with new challenges, with new aspects. Regular updates might be very helpful for both sides. The transparency of impact and uptake of the method is difficult for us due to the confidentiality and the long study periods. I think it's often difficult to bring it up with own publications, I think. And we are very depending on the ANSEP documentation, which really brings up the protocol or our involvement only. And I think especially for post-authorization efficacy studies, this is on our wish list. That is also an obligation to make it even visible and for that purpose. So the continuous dialogue might be a very important one. Yeah, next slide. To wrap up, I think the qualification opinion was a challenge and a milestone for the ECS FPR. The different aims, perspectives, and also languages due to the different EMA initiatives and also boards, I think was very important. To keep the balance between quality and quantity of the data is extremely essential for us because we have different stakeholders on board. The resources and demands, and Peter Moore mentioned that the qualification is not covered by any funding, and we are depending on the basic funding, is very essential here. But we keep also the balance between the commitment and the professionalization of the registry, and to have a continuous adjustment and enhancement of the registry. We depend on the continuous dialogue with the medical authorization holders and the EMA. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Lutz, for a very nice presentation and for sticking to time. So we're going to move now to our, our last presenter. So we're going to hear now about the experience from the TREAT-NMD registry or network of registries, which is going to be provided by Neil Bennett, who is the research and communication manager from the TREAT-NMD. Neil, when you are ready, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invite to talk today. I thought as part of this, it would probably be useful to tell a little bit of the story of our registry network, because some of the complexities of both our organization and the registry network have kind of fed directly into the discussions and the qualification process. So if we have the next slide. So TREAT-NMD is a group of organizations, I suppose. Were originally set up back in 2006-07 by a European grant that established a network of excellence in the neuromuscular field. And part of that network was the development of a set of registries, a registry network that could work together. More recently, I think it was appreciated that being able to enter commercial contracts would be and hire staff would be a useful activity for the network. And so 2 companies were set up. The first, a charity registered in the UK, and the second, a wholly owned subsidiary of that charity that's effectively the business arm of TREAT-NMD. And those companies are owned by the network and really work to drive forward the network's aims. But the key here for the kind of discussion about the registries is it gives us a platform to provide both charitable activities, so whether that's supporting registries around the world through grants or bursaries, or undertaking commercial activities on behalf of the registries, we're able to provide those services. So if we have the next slide. This is a kind of overview of our aims, and I appreciate that there's a lot of words on this slide, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of pieces. And the first one there is the top left, where what we're trying to do is to accelerate the development of effective treatments and to really establish best practice in diagnosis and care for neuromuscular patients around the world. And within our goals, you can see some that are closely linked to the provision of data and the registry network. And that's one of our key goals, is to provide data that can drive forward the access to treatments for patients. If we have the next slide. And so Treat&MD is active across the drug development process. We work with pharmaceutical industries, CROs, patient organizations around the world and across the whole kind of gamut of drug development. And you'll see on here some of them will come up later. So since probably the early 2010s, we've been undertaking global registry inquiries, providing data to support trial development. We provide education. And more recently, we've moved into the area of being able to provide patient-level information from the registry network. Next slide, please. And so, as you mentioned, the Treat&MD Global Registry Network is a federated network of registries. So we bring together independent registries from around the world. Next slide. And there's currently 67 registries within the network. This map just shows where those registries are based. Importantly, it doesn't necessarily show where data is collected. It shows where the registries are. The majority of the registries in the network are, well, in fact, if we take the next slide, the majority of the, and press next, sorry. Thank you. The majority of the registries in the network are national registries, coupled to some that are regional. And then there's also a group of international registries within the network. Some of those are global registries, generally collecting patient information about a very rare neuromuscular disease on a global scale. Other international registries collect data on patients from a selected group of countries, typically neighboring countries or small groups of neighboring countries. The registries, if we press next, the registries are a heterogeneous group. Some are clinically reported data sets, some are patient reported, some involve both patient and clinician in the reporting of data, and others collect data directly from patients and ask clinicians to verify it. And so you can imagine our qualification journey was slightly complex in that we had an awful lot of different options to cover off within the application. If we take the next slide. In terms of scale, the network as a whole collects data on about 65,000 patients. I mentioned 67 registries, and approximately 3/4 of those patients have a genetically confirmed disease. There's at least 13 diseases covered by the registry network. 13 is a slightly odd number, I appreciate. It's driven effectively by those diseases where we've had inquiries about data. So there's at least 13. In reality, we know there's probably many more, since some of our registries collect data across all neuromuscular conditions. Next slide. And so our qualification journey probably started, if we look in the kind of longest possible term, probably started back in 2018 or 2019. And that was when the Treat&MD registry network as a whole started thinking about being able to undertake post-authorization studies. Until then, the registries had been collecting data that was really aimed at providing feasibility planning for clinical trial, recruitment support for clinical trials. And so in 2018 or 19, there was a kind of move towards being able to support new kinds of studies. And we started that process by updating our mandatory data sets. So within each disease area, the registry members of the network agree to collect data using a specified data model. And that includes a data dictionary. It sets out the fields that should be collected, how they should be collected, who should fill the data in. And the process was really aimed in the long term towards qualification. If we take the next slide. The kind of more formal part of that process, I suppose, started just over a year ago. we first started talking to the EMA about applying for qualification in late 2021. And a big part of that for us was to work out precisely what we should ask to be qualified in. We asked for advice to start with. We felt that was a really useful thing for us, especially because we felt that our first application would probably inform lots of decisions we were making in other diseases and in building infrastructure and things. And so we chose to apply for qualification advice in a single disease, and we chose spinal muscular atrophy. And there were probably three main drivers for that decision. It was the disease area that had the most mature expanded core data set. That's both in the kind of length of time the data set had been published, so that registries were able to collect it, but it was also the disease area where we had supported most registries to help them kind of drive the changes that were needed to adopt that core data set. So we felt it was the condition that had most registries collecting data using our expanded data sets. We're also obviously aware that treatments were available in SMA, and we felt that probably meant there were most data requirements in that condition. And that was based on discussions we'd had in the pharmaceutical industry, as well as with patient organizations and registries themselves. And it was also the condition where our infrastructure was most advanced. So we decided that our advice would cover both the data set, but also the processes and the infrastructure we were using to collect that. And I'll come on to that point in a few seconds. So the next slide just sets out a little bit about our SMA registry network. There's 37 registries in that network, and in the map you can see dark blue highlighting the kind of areas where we have a core registry, light blue affiliated registries. And affiliated registries are those who are part of the network but are not necessarily as yet collecting the most up-to-date data set. And in the kind of middle blue there, you can see countries where there's both a core and an affiliate registry. And so there's 37 registries in the network, and collectively they hold data on just over 9,000 patients, with 7,735 of those having a genetic diagnosis. This is from our kind of registry survey at the end of last year. If we have the next slide. So this is a complex slide, but I just want to spend a little bit of time talking through it, because this illustrates in one slide an awful lot of the challenges, well, maybe the questions we had around qualification, I suppose, is probably the way to put it. So on the left, you can see a greenish circle, which is the registry network. So as I mentioned, the registries are independent registries. So TreatNMD doesn't have control over the registries, but to become a member, each registry signs the TGDoc charter. It's the charter of our registry network. And part of that is that they will agree to abide by the governance decisions made by the TreatNMD Global Registries Oversight Committee, the TGDoc. So within that registry network, we have a set of registries, the red circles. And as you can imagine, a registry network on the scale we're talking here, many of those registries may not have the resources to develop platforms to collect data. We knew that many of our registries were using Excel or even paper data collection forms. And so back in 2020, we released the GRP, our Global Registries Platform. And that was a platform that we developed with some IT developers that aimed to provide registries with a compliant, easy-to-use platform. We developed it so it could accept data from either clinicians or patients. And whilst it was never designed to be a truly cutting-edge platform, it was designed to support registries who needed a platform, who didn't have access to one. And so within the network, there's a subset of registries who are using our platform. And the data sets, those harmonized data sets, are built to that platform at the most basic level. So the whole platform is built around those models. That data set also feeds into the registry network and also into the CDW on this slide. That's our central data warehouse.
2 minutes reminder.
And so, thank you. And so the data flow here effectively goes from right to left. Patients and clinicians enter data into the registries. Treat10MD receives inquiries. We can ask those registries to provide data to meet those inquiries, and the data flows back into the central data warehouse through various quality control. Treat10MD can analyze that data and pass the results to an inquirer. Next slide. And so because of that complexity, we sought advice on that whole infrastructure in the context of SMA and for various uses that you can see in this slide. And one of the reasons here was that we were trying to use the advice process to help us develop systems for other diseases. And actually, it's been really, really useful for that process. I'd echo some of the comments from the last speaker about the tight deadlines. They were a challenge. I think we took a slightly different approach, which was to gain the registry's permission that we were doing this on their behalf within certain parameters, which meant that we didn't have to ask questions about every question. Within a certain remit, we could answer those questions using the governance model we already had in place. And so, next slide, please. Just before Christmas last year, we were issued with a letter for support. And actually, this has already been really quite useful for us in conversations with the pharmaceutical industry and with registries as well. It's really helped us talk to registries about the next steps we need to take, mainly in areas of assurance around patient consent. That's devolved to the registries in the network, but obviously we have to provide assurance. And also developments for the data set and the data model. And this is already helping us to think about how we're fulfilling projects that we're currently undertaking. And so we're currently working through the things that were raised, the things we need to do some more work on, developing processes with a view to coming back for qualification or to ask for qualification, hopefully later this year in SMA, and also applying what we've learned into other conditions, DMD, limb-girdle, muscular dystrophy, with a view to asking for advice about those in the near future as well. And I'll just hit the next slide and say thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Neil. And I think with this, we conclude the first part of the session. And I would like to ask my colleagues to post the Slido code so that you can post your questions or comments there, so that we can tackle them at the discussion. So I think Peter, my colleague Peter Moll, will now take the chair seat for this discussion. So Peter, when you're ready.
So thanks, Quango, and thanks to all the speakers that were so much in time, which I can really learn a lot from. But having said that, I think while we're waiting for some of the questions, we obviously have three speakers, our panelists, who can chime in the discussion once the questions are running in. And these would be Elisabeth Vroom from the Duchenne organization, was already there yesterday. Julian Isla, also very well acknowledged patient representative, but from the Dravet syndrome, also very experienced with registry and building that from the patient perspective themselves. And Uwe Sponer, who is a history also in the regulatory world as chair of the vice chair of the PRAC, but in the meantime has moved on to the side to the industry side and is now a director of regulatory policy and intelligence. So please, also when you give a brief statement, maybe introduce yourselves a little more so we have a good idea of your background. But what I would be interested in while we're waiting for some of the questions to come in, could we maybe could you give your perspective from the panelists' perspective on, okay, if a registry would be qualified, then how do you foresee that industry and regulators and the registry owners still interact further, as I think also Lutz mentioned that post discussion was really again more two-sided instead of having the triangle partners involved. So perhaps Uwe, maybe that would be a question that I could ask first to you.
Thanks very much, Peter. And thanks very much, first of all, to the agency and to the experts from the network for hosting this multi-stakeholder workshop. I think as industry, we welcome this opportunity to take stock of what can be learned from experience with qualification, but also, as you said in your introductory presentation, Peter, use of registries more generally to inform future approaches to building confidence in the use of novel data sources and methodologies. And I think as part of this reflection, it's really important to consider the regulatory uptake of the use of registries and what the qualification procedure has contributed. So very much building on the conversation from yesterday. And what really came through in those really nice presentations today was the need for this more iterative life cycle trialogue. And it is a trialogue. And I think, Lutz, you mentioned, the need to sustain cooperation through the life cycle. And certainly as developers, we see that as we think about the need, for the qualification process to evolve, perhaps it should become more iterative so that it's not necessary to go back through the entire qualification submission for each question about feasibility or the administration or governance of the registry. So that's certainly a point that resonates with medicines developers. Then practically speaking, how could we, maybe make progress in the short term? One of the ideas I think that came through in the PRO session yesterday was, as part of a life cycle approach, could there be value in sharing information on the regulatory uptake here of registries? Perhaps an overview could be developed. And I think another area that came through yesterday as well is how can we increase awareness around, the qualification of a registry, its status over time? Could the opinion be supported by a Q&A that provides framework to the context of use and guidance to potential users so that they can think about its relevance to the question that they're seeking to consider. So I think this idea of a life cycle trialogue and greater understanding shared learnings around the regulatory uptake of registries are really important ideas.
So thanks, Ulfa. That life cycle approach, it sounds something like that is a very apt kind of positioning of how we should go about patient data. Maybe Julian and also Elisabeth, one of the things that was also brought up, at least which I brought up, is the patient reported outcome and information that is being collected by patients themselves sometimes in certain registries. Could you give a sort of perspective on that? Maybe start with Julian this time.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, my name is Julian Isla. I'm patient representative. I'm supporting Dravet Syndrome Federation. I'm also the founder of Dravet Syndrome Federation. I have a son with Dravet Syndrome. I have experience as a patient representative because I know firsthand how difficult it is to collect data from patients. It's difficult, right? I have also experience as a regulator because I've been 8 years as member of the COMP, and I'm very exposed to the complexity of making decisions, especially on significant benefit. Significant benefit is an important element in our regulation, and we are struggling to realize significant benefit for most of the applications we are evaluating. And this is a problem not just for the COMP, but also for CHMP as well. And I have also experienced as an applicant because our organization applied to the qualification process for a registry we did several years ago. Let me be very direct, Okay, maybe a little bit controversial. The way we work doesn't work. Doesn't work. Let me explain you why. We have an issue with data standardization for prompts. In the same way that we have a good standards for medical entities, and we have ICD and multiple ways of coding medical entities, and we have a good mechanism to identify drugs, ATC codes, and symptoms, SNOMED. There are multiple options. We don't have a good mechanism to identify prompts. We don't. And this is an issue, especially when we have to use computers for analysis. The problem of data standardization is the problem of having, or in this case, not having a common language. We don't have a common language. We spend a lot of time describing what we are trying to achieve, what we want to measure. This is because the lack of a common language. And it's very difficult because we have to measure disabilities, we have to measure comorbidities, we have to measure value. Super complex. As Peter already mentioned, in the presentation he did, drug codes is easy. We have the ATCs, that's easy. But even for that, the information was missing in the registry even for something easy. That's the reason why caregiving involvement is so difficult to measure, because we don't have a common language to name this. The guideline that the EMA released a couple of years ago is a good starting point, but it's not enough. Because when you, as a patient organization, you try to implement this guideline, you don't have the tools to do it. We don't. The guideline is the recommendation, but from the recommendation to the real registry, still we have a big gap. And also, and this is a call for the EMA, is probably as a patient organization, we need more support from you, especially for small organizations. Most of the patient organizations, they don't have the experience, they don't have the money, they don't have the technical writers, they don't have the people with expertise in the regulation, and qualification is complex. We have to go through a big process, taking years, in most of the time, and we are alone. So probably we need to rethink how we can do that process. And just to finish, the data collected by pharma has to be shared as well, especially clinical trials. My son has been involved in 2 clinical studies. I don't have any data from any of those, If we are not able to collect data from clinical trials and make sure this data is accessible, the starting point is not really fixed, And also, how patient organization can keep independence from the industry and avoid conflict of interest capturing data, Probably we need new mechanisms and new ecosystems, financial ecosystems, in order to allow this. As the treat NMD show us, they have to create 2 organizations, one for the commercial use, one for the, and maybe this is the path to go, but we have to be more specific on this, and also to avoid problems to the pharma industry as well, right? Because sometimes they don't want the data, they want just to use the data, So the problem, from my point of view, is still there. And the patients, we don't have incentives to collect data. We don't, That's one of the problems I face with my organization. We are asking patients to put data on the registries. They say, okay, maybe they start, but after some months, some years, they drop, because in most of cases, the incentives, they are not there in a very easy way. And because, I'm a software engineer, so just a small comment regarding technology, because the new technology that we are starting to see, especially large language models, the new technology that, OpenAI, GPT-4, ChatGPT, all these companies are using, is not using structured data. No structured data at all, you know what I mean? So maybe in the future, the place where we have to go is a new system where the patient will put all the information they have, and this large language model will be able to extract, the knowledge and the relevant information. Thank you so much for the invitation to the workshop. I'm very happy to address your questions. And I've been working with Elizabeth, which is the next speaker, on different initiatives for data collection. So I will give the floor to Elizabeth as well. But remember, you know, in most of the presentations, the patient is in the middle. There are people around the patient, regulators, pharma, doctors, but I don't think we as patients, we want to be in the center. It's like being in the center, everybody's dancing around you, but we want to dance. You know what I mean? We don't want to be in the center. We want to be with you at the same level.
A very nice comment, Julian. Indeed, we always put the patient center, like, okay, this is where we really need to work around. But I understand your analogy that we should really be more working together and not so much looking at. Thanks, very good. Also, that other look I was thinking is a very interesting one, where you said, okay, so patient registries with more curated data and the more easily accessible, in my mind, at least from the plethora of real-world data. But where you say, well, in the end, we may go into a way that our computer power is becoming so powerful that we can indeed analyze data that is much more unstructured. Elizabeth, I think it's indeed up to you now to talk a little bit on, okay, how can we look at sharing data? What is the possibility of perhaps getting the data from the trials in the Duchenne field perhaps together? And also how can patients collaborate to make better use of those type of data?
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to speak after so many good speakers. So this is really a nice setting. So to start with, I mean, patients are really in favor. In the Duchenne field, we prepare the declaration. Patients are in favor of optimal reuse of their data, whether it's the data from registries, whether it's e-health data, because they know all that data are everywhere in silo and very often not reused. So, but then the same, which was already mentioned, I think, in cystic fibrosis, is the informed consent. The dynamic informed consent would, of course, be the best way to go, as there's really a difference in if patients want to consent to use by companies or by research or by their own clinicians. And one of the things we indeed face is with the PROMs, not only that, for example, in Darwin, OMOP coding is an obligation, let's say, or a prerequisite, but there is no OMOP coding for PROMs. So the PROMs, which really could give more insight in what is relevant to patients, are difficult to include in certain real-world evidence, let's say, environments in the ecosystem. Of course, we can do it in our own registries, but that is something else. And from the beginning, I think it is important to discuss, and I haven't heard this today, the interoperability of data sources. I think that is, data should be collected with interoperability in mind. And maybe I can give two examples which in the context of today. One is if we speak about patients deciding about the data to themselves, together with Julian or his Foundation 29, we build data lockers for Duchenne patients where they can bring in all the data from different sources, whether it's from their hospital data, their PROMs, their PROs. But also, we now have the first companies giving back the data from the clinical trials to the individual patients, and they can also put that in their data locker. So with that, you have, and especially in the rare disease, it's important, a much richer data set of one patient together, and from there, this could be brought in. We have spoken with some of you about the qualification of these data. However, then quite early in the conversation came up, but then you need a context of use, where we feel as patients, and that's also a difficult part, these data could be used for a lot of things, for the unmet need to start with, for the early, for example, we get early contact. That's now the new CHMP thing. We are contacted. Can you tell us more about a certain disease? it would be nice if we as patient organizations already then would have access to the real world evidence, patient organization in general, to bring this in this early contact, because otherwise, what do you say there? It's more than your personal impression. So if you see that the EMA patients are in all committees, patient representatives, how nice would it be if they also would be able to bring in data to this discussion? Not only my opinion is, I heard this, we think this, but really kind of have a basis for what they bring in these discussions. And that's the same, like I think you, Peter, mentioned the 3 areas, where for the data, but in fact, also there, to use them in all areas, you have to make sure that you then have a qualification in several contexts of use. So I think that, and then last but not least, and I also spoke with Julian about it, it's really, there's, for example, a paper speaking about patient relevant data. If you look at the website of EMA, patient relevant data is everywhere, right? And we all adhere to this. We like that expression. However, there was a review of the scientific papers that in only 1/3, a little bit more than 1/3, I think it was 36%, these patient relevant data were justified by patients as being indeed relevant. So also there, I think we really have to look more careful into if we want patient relevant data in the whole regulatory process, if that is indeed what we want, then we should also, if we speak about these real world evidence and these sources, look into and what are patient relevant data. So not what the doctor think is relevant, and he might be fantastic or she might be fantastic. That is something else. But if we speak about patient relevant data, at least you should check with the patient. I think yesterday I tried to make a plea that patients should be earlier involved in all these processes and earlier say what is relevant to them. So you really get a data source that is optimal to be used along the whole pathway of the drug development. I think we don't have, it's 1:15, so I think I leave it here.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So I think we indeed will move into the questions that are now on the screen. And I think the first one is one about the retrospective consenting for the secondary use of data. And maybe Lutz and sorry, Neil, I lost your name. Could briefly respond to that. How is that organized within your registry datasets?
I can start. I think for me, it's important that the patient has a good understanding of the governance of the registry and trust and believe in the governance and who is holding the data. The CF Europe as a patient organization is involved in our registry and in the executive committee from the beginning. So I think this is very important. Going back, so I think each scientific request, we got around 20 per year, could not be retrospectively reconsented. So I think we have to be a trustee organization who is also transparent in the requests and in the results and sharing that. I think for the pharmacovigilance studies, I think we have to be aware that sometimes it's historical data, historical cohorts, or even control cohorts. And with 54,000 patients, I think it's really impossible to go for retrospective consent. It's more important, I think, to explain that in a widely and open field, not as a broad consent, but I think explain it as a research construction, and then to say the governance is clear. It's discussed with the patient representatives. It's discussed with each of the countries, so that there really is trust-based, I think. Otherwise, we could not go into that. GDPR gives us a good solution, I think, to do that. I think to update the consent process. And one word about the patient-reported outcome. I think I really like that idea. But is this really real-world practice? In CF, for example, it's not paid by the health insurance in Germany to have a patient-reported outcome measurement. So can we expect that we have it for all the patients? It's the same for anxiety and depression screening, I think, where we do not have these patient-reported outcomes because we have to do it in additional efforts, and we could not depend on the one who will send us the data voluntarily because there is a major bias and we do not get the full data set and the full overview.
Thanks for adding that thought, because it's an interesting one also. But maybe, Neil, could you speak also to this point made by Francois Hoyer on the retrospective consenting?
Yes, so the consent for us is dealt with by the individual registries themselves. So the patients or the clinicians, or the patients or the patient via a clinician interact only with the registry. So Treat and MD is the kind of organizing body, doesn't have direct contact with the patient. Retrospective consent is an interesting one. So what we tend to take the view of is, so the registries send us the details of the consent they hold, and we ensure that they've collected that consent properly, and what they say they hold, they actually hold, if that makes sense. The huge effort thing, I think, if we've certainly been in the situation where we've needed to reconsent patients for particular studies, and in those situations we reconsented only the patients who would be taking part in the study. So it wasn't a retrospective reconsent of, I guess, 80,000 patients or something. But in those situations where something like that is necessary, the huge effort needed wouldn't be something that would put us off, I think, if that makes sense. So I think if we were in a situation where the only way to hold proper consent for a patient to be in a study was to go and reconsent a group of patients, that's what we would try and do. And we'd support the individual registries to do that, either by providing grants or resource in terms of people to help them go and do that. So it's a tricky one. And especially for us where consent is devolved and we provide assurance, it's a slightly different model to many individual registries held by a patient organization where maybe it's more feasible to go and or retrospectively reconsent 100 or 500 or 1,000 patients.
Thank you. I think the next question is a little bit moving on, continuing on the previous question, where the question is how could we get more broader consent? And perhaps this is a question that Julian and Elisabeth also could speak from the perspective of the patient organization. How would patients be able to express, how could patients be asked more to offer that broad consent for their data use? So Julian, maybe.
Well, from my point of view, I don't think patients like broad consent. I mean, because it's not like when you are donating your organs, it's like a broad consent, you don't have any clue where your organ is going to be, but you don't care because you are dead. Fine. But when you are donating your data, it's different because you are alive. And the donation can have consequences and implications. So this is a big difference, not just from a legal point of view, but from a patient point of view. So I guess the future is going to be a place where the patients will have dynamic consents. And independent of the type of the request, you will receive a notification and you will be able to say, yes, I want to give my data for this use, but I don't want to give my data for this one. In the past, this was impossible, because in the age of papers, no way to do it, right? But right now, with everybody connected at some point, it will be doable, And in the same way, when we are getting into a website, right now we are saying, yes, I want to use my data for this. I don't want cookies. You know what I mean? Probably the future will be a similar place.
Thanks. So I also saw a question. It dropped now again, but there was an interesting one which I wanted to also give my co-chair a bit of a chance of talking, and because I alluded to the possibility of the Darwin network and the data that we are collecting there, and as Julian already mentioned, we may be able to get into those data much more less structured. So I was wondering, could you, there it is. Could you talk to that question a bit, Juanjo, as being involved very much in the Darwin project? So how can committees work with Darwin EU perhaps and include registries in those kind of analyses?
Thank you, Peter. I mean, that's a very good question. So in principle, excuse me, Darwin EU follows the so-called CAN data quality framework, and it is implemented through a number of checks using R packages, and there are some initiatives within the so Darwin EU board essentially some tools from the OTSI network. And essentially, this is a number of checks that are implemented via code on the data sources, on the databases, if you want. And there are more than 3,000 checks, and they essentially try to ensure that some quality dimensions are properly informed by several metrics each to ensure internal consistency, validity, timeliness, etc. We also look into other aspects, as you mentioned, around governance, etc. But I think the short answer to the question is there is no formal qualification process for these data sources. These are done through the, as I said, through one of the data quality frameworks that are published out there in the literature and widely accepted by the scientific community. And related to this, the EMA is actually also building a more overarching data quality framework that is, by the way, was open for consultation at the end of last year, beginning of this year. And we expect to have a final version soon available to be published. And again, that looks at 5 dimensions of quality and suggests some metrics to measure each of those dimensions. I hope this answers the question.
Thanks, Congo. And that goes a little bit into the question, although it's asking about the funding of the work by Francois. It's also about how if you have data, how do you describe the quality, and how should common data elements and governance be properly explained? Maybe that would again be something to the people that have undergone a qualification procedure. How would you recommend others to describe their data very well? There's a data quality framework by the EMA. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but could you talk a little bit to that? Again, Lutz, perhaps.
I think we started, with timelessness of the data. We have a yearly process of collecting data with a deadline and the data quality assurance afterwards. We have in the data collection software, strict rules to apply on the data. For example, date or out of range data, or also a consistency across the years. So I think the software is very essential. Then I think the consistency is also important. And then we also come up, with data verification, on-site verification in the centers to really see if the definitions, which might be complex in an annual data set. For example, the best FEV1, what is it? Have you chosen it? So I think this is not be seen by the data itself. So we went out to the centers, see some discrepancy or see missing data sources, for example, for genetic results in adult populations, and really stimulate the discussion about really tackling and coming to the best balance between quality and quantity. So I think for the data quality, it's a very huge project, and then to come up with consistency, accuracy, and completeness and so on. But I think some needs the data on-site verification. I'm very sure about that. to really in line with a lot of these data collectors, which have different backgrounds also. Mm-hmm. Does it answer your question?
Yeah, it does a bit, obviously. I mean, but maybe Neil, so you really explain also how the choice of the variables comes about, and I think that's really important indeed. What I was trying to go and move a little bit beyond that data quality collection and the description of that, which obviously some guidance I would assume also be helpful from our side, and I think we will have to also work with it. I think some of you mentioned the registry-based guideline that gives you a bit of a handle, but not yet a complete, let's say, structured. A request tool of UNETA might already be more structured in the way what it expects you to describe, but I think there will be some future work on that. I was trying to go to ask Ulva perhaps a question that Quango and I already had in our mind when we were preparing this and really talking, okay, what would now be the types of studies that you as an industry, but also perhaps others would think of could be solved with using these registry data. And if you were to do that and are going to select, let's say, over from the perspective of a company having a product, would you be thinking of, let's say, a mock study, so a study protocol to give that to a registry in terms of, okay, what can they actually provide of kind of information? Could you speak a little bit to the types of question you would go for with the registries?
Yeah, thanks very much, Peter. And I think one of the great opportunities is, that this can drive collaborative evidence generation, and appreciate, the distinction you made yourself earlier between the data source and the study conducted within the data source. And I guess, when we're considering fitness for purpose, we'll be looking at it in the context of a particular research question. But alongside that, we'll also be thinking about, what could be done here to create clearer expectations for registries around, use of evidence for regulatory purposes. And if I just might build on the conversation you've just had, I think there really is an opportunity to consider how the qualification process might use the data quality framework to facilitate the qualification process, because perhaps there is, within the regulatory mandate, the opportunity to have tools such as checklists to apply the data quality framework, could focus on minimum requirements, maybe metrics, I think it was mentioned earlier, for data quality might be needed. And there are tools there, I think you mentioned the request tools, but not always necessarily the most intuitive for academic registry operators. So we might need to have clearer definitions on the level that's needed, how to respond to questions in using these tools. And one of the things that we would be looking at is, things like linkage to other data sources. I think it was something you mentioned, Peter. How do we, create greater awareness around some of the, important aspects like the timeframes that registries must keep in mind to get a positive qualification opinion or to remain qualified. So I think, as we think about the evolving ecosystem, clinical evidence generation getting more rounded, considering a range of data sources, I think it'll be the research question will always drive our consideration of fitness for purpose, of real world evidence, and then looking at a particular data source and its fitness for purpose to answer a research question with the right methodology and analytical approach. But in that context, I think there's more that we can do to bridge this gap so that there is greater clarity for everyone involved in the ecosystem around the fitness of qualified registries and data sets for an intended purpose. So a really great conversation today, and lots of work and shared learnings to look forward to.
Okay, thanks, Ulva, for that. So it's time to wrap up. I mean, the time goes then really fast if you're just talking about your hobbies, I shouldn't say, but our very shared interests and something that is more than just data out there. I think it's also really going to be an important tool, but we need to understand that it's not a one-off, probably the qualification procedure. I think we heard today it's life cycle kind of approach. We may have to also then re-emphasize that interaction, which I think is so good before the, let's say, the qualification, all the parties involved there, but also after that. It's not again talking industry with the registry owner and the regulator only. I think we indeed talked about the data quality framework and perhaps providing checklists which make it clear how to go into that qualification procedure, but also what you should have just to describe the quality of your registry. I think that's an important lesson. I think we will have some more to talk about the patient-reported outcomes and prompts, because one of the things that in my mind would be very beneficial is we can capture those in registries, but we also heard about the challenges of doing that and not having, let's say, single standards, although we could emphasize the use of more validated kind of, more common kind of PROs. But okay, that is something that I think needs more work. Then obviously the interoperability is important, and the linkage with other data sets, I think, is something there. We talked a bit about Darwin. And finally, well, maybe in a couple of years' time, we can forget all about this and we just write it somewhere, and GPT-4 or 5 or 10 will pick it all up and combine all the data that is out there. I think that is a future vision. Not sure if that's a happy one or not, but that's not per se for today. Juanco, I'm giving the floor back to you, and then to wrap it up and maybe lead us to the coffee break.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much to everyone who contributed to the discussion. I'm sorry that some of the questions that are posted there are very interesting. We don't have time to address them, but yeah, it's been, I think, a useful discussion for us, and hopefully has given us very good food for thoughts in order to improve the qualification process for data sources. So I think in the interest of time, we're going to close this first session of the second day of the workshop, and let's go for a coffee, and we will resume in 5 minutes, I believe. Thank you very much, everyone.
So good afternoon, everyone. I hope you had the chance for a quick bio break and maybe a quick coffee stop. My name is Jordanis Gravanis. I'm the head of the Scientific Advice Office at the EMA, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you this afternoon, together with my co-chairs for this session, Paolo Foggi, who's the head of Innovation Pharmaceutical Strategy Division at the Italian Medicines Agency, also the chair of our Scientific Advice Working Party, and Pierre de Molis, Scientific Advisor in the General Direction of the National Agency for the Safety of Medicine and Health Products in France, and the Vice Chair of the Scientific Advice Working Party. So to welcome you to this fifth and final session of our workshop. And we envisage this session to be a working one, so to be a session where we don't have any presentations, we don't have any position statements, but we really have a 2-hour discussion on using qualification from in the future, and what would be the ways to optimize the platform. So we thought we should structure the discussion around 6 topics. These topics will be shown consecutively to you, and we're going to be spending, or the plan is to spend around 20 minutes on each one of these questions. We would very much welcome and invite your participation via Slido. The Slido code, which is the same as before, will continue to be showed throughout this 2-hour session. And but in order to kick off the discussion on each of the topics, we also have a very nice panel. Mainly we stole participants from previous sessions to put this together. So in our panel today, we have Andres Kiricic, one of the co-chairs of the PRO session, Jörg Zinserling, one of the co-chairs of the digital session, Peter Moll, one of the co-chairs of the real-world evidence session. We also have Lutz Nerlich from the RWE session, but we also have Mireille Müller, Executive Regulatory Policy Director at Novartis, and known suspect in the applicants for qualification procedures. And we also have Klaus Romero, Chief Scientific Officer from the Critical Path Institute. The panel is completed with Julian Isla, who was also just in the RWE session or immediately before. So we will be using the panel to kick off the discussion, but then we would be really looking forward to your questions and your statements via Slido, which we will be showing on the screen. Now, we also understand that with so many participants and with many people potentially or hopefully wanting to contribute to the session, it might not be possible to do so. So what we are going to do is we are going immediately after the closure of the workshop today to launch a survey sent to all participants, where the same questions, the same topics that we will be discussed during this session will be presented to you with questions for you to answer. Okay. And so without any further delay, I think, Jana, we can go to the first topic of the discussion. Okay, so the very first topic of the discussion is about the future scope of qualification and the expertise needs, necessary to be able to support qualification of novel methodologies that may come our way. We had a full session on this yesterday, and in our discussions in preparation of this session, obviously we realized that the qualification has been used historically to qualify many diverse types of methodologies. It's a rather flexible procedure. We don't, say no to much, but I think that what, because of remit and legal constraints, we have to say no to is the qualification of not the qualification, but the certification of medical devices or in vitro diagnostics, for example, which often come hand in hand with, the qualification of a methodology to which they apply. I think that it was also mentioned yesterday by Solange that the qualification of a methodology should be technology agnostic. That is potentially, easier said than done, especially when it comes to the more, novel or the more recent qualification objects involving digital health technologies, artificial intelligence, machine learning. I guess the more general question is to what extent to be qualified methodology can actually be separated and qualified separately from devices or other forms of intellectual property which are associated, which are employed, so to speak, in the application of this methodology. Of course, with intellectual property considerations come questions about transparency and to what extent we can be transparent about qualifications which are still in development, so not really at the qualification stage, but really at the stage of just receiving qualification advice. Can we be transparent about those if there is no, for example, letter of support necessarily issued for them? And of course, with all of this comes the question that all of these novel methodologies also require, types of expertise that were not historically or traditionally been used, by regulators. And again, it's been mentioned yesterday, medical device experts, all types of other decision makers and stakeholders, to what extent they can or they should be part of the qualification process. So these are some high level thoughts and questions, and I would like to invite Mireille Müller to maybe give us a position on these questions. Mireille, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jordanis. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk to this workshop and to the qualifications per se, which is very dear to my heart. So to address your 2 points, first, I believe that intellectual property is really not a barrier to qualification and vice versa. And the second point, if consortia or applicants sort out legal and intellectual property matters right from the start, actually there shouldn't be any problem, or at least the problem should be minimized substantially. Overall, at the industry level, we are really looking forward for a broad adoption of regulatory qualified endpoints as powerful tools to simplify clinical trials, accelerate drug development, and provide innovative treatments to patients faster. So the IP strategy should encourage and support the adoption of digital endpoints, for example. So that seems to be clear. I would also share what you just said and building on what Solange said in her entry position yesterday. So far, in our experience has been that digital endpoints qualification have been technology agnostic. So this should hopefully remain the case for future application. I know it's probably simpler said than done. Otherwise, we have also heard from Julian just in the previous session about AI. So far, we see that there are well-established laws on patentability of softwares, and these apply to AI as well. AI might be simply a sophisticated form of software. So we will see how the future, what the future will bring. But in Europe, as in most countries, actually, the software itself cannot be patented, but only its use. So we will have to monitor that, but the software code can be protected, but we will see how the application goes. And to address your second part of the question, can we be transparent enough at the time of the qualification, or would IP rights create restriction? Actually, patents, for example, are not an obstacle to transparency at all. Quite to the contrary, patents applications are published, are in the public domain, and they should help to disseminate technical and scientific knowledge. It's one of the basic principles, really, and advantages of the patent system. So any device agnostic endpoint qualification mandates a full description of the measures in order to ensure that they can be replicated. I hope this addresses some of your questions.
Thank you so much, Mireille. Very insightful. And as we're waiting for questions to arrive through Slido, maybe I will give the floor to Klaus.
Thank you. Just checking that you can hear me okay.
Very well. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. So a couple of thoughts regarding what you have on the slide. The first one is that a novel methodology is intended to serve as a solution to a very specific unmet need in drug development. And it needs to be, everything else needs to be treated with that compass. When you have a new methodology, you need to have a context of use statement. And for digital health technologies, there is a tendency to equate them to potential applications as primary endpoints, which is a potentially valid application of those technologies in drug development, but it's not the only possible application. And so it goes back to the context of use statement. Now, the other piece about the algorithms themselves, there's two routes that don't need to be mutually exclusive. When you're talking about a medical device that is based on a digital health technology, you can keep the algorithm, hidden or protected and just open it up for the regulatory review part of the device itself. That's fine. But the evidence that you need to demonstrate for that product as a device has to do with decisions that you inform at the individual patient level. When you're talking about a methodology that informs a very specific unmet need in drug development, you're talking about the algorithm having to be supported for decisions at the population level, for trial design, trial execution, those kinds of things. The optimization of selection of patients for trials, I mean, everything that has to do with how you generate the evidence for the drug, not for the device. And so with that distinction, you can keep the algorithm that manages the decision making at the population level as a drug development tool open source, and it's not mutually competitive with the fact that you can keep the algorithm hidden that does make decisions at the individual patient level as part of a price discussion. Those are not mutually exclusive things and can be separated. I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Klaus. And maybe since we still have some time on this topic, maybe I could ask Jörg Zinserling, sorry to put you on the spot, Jörg, but maybe to reflect a little bit also on some of the discussions on qualifications from last week. Obviously, without being able to go into details and specifics, to not to disclose confidential information, but maybe reflecting a little bit on the discussions from last week on a couple of qualifications. What do you think? How easy it is indeed to separate the methodology from the technology, or being able to really define what should be in the control of the, say, device or soft or technology holder versus the applicant. Jörg?
Yes, thanks for giving me the opportunity to react to what was just said by Mireille and Klaus, and I tend to agree to both of them. I would say that in principle, a qualification could be device agnostic, because as Klaus nicely explained, performance assessment could pertain to the device level and assessment of a device in an individual patient, and ensuring that the device is fit for purpose for measuring outcomes that are relevant for the clinical application. And this may be separated from the assessment of clinical performance. And what is currently missing in our procedures, and also in many qualification procedures not fully addressed, is that we have a framework for assessment of performance of the tools versus an assessment of the performance of the clinical outcomes. And I think there needs to be some development, and also the development of a framework to enable such an assessment. And I would envisage that we may also need to learn from each other, from industry giving input into this, and from our side thinking about what performance levels we would need for qualifying something that would in the end be device agnostic. So I agree that there should be a way forward, but this has to be developed maybe with input from both sides. Thanks.
Thank you, Jörg. Indeed, with this novel, methodologies that we've been, faced in recent years, it's clear that, there is room to kind of learn together and to try as much as possible to bring all relevant, stakeholders and decision makers, around the table in these discussions, rather than, constantly worrying and contemplating about, the remit of each one. But maybe since we're still at the topic of, IP and personal, not personal, but like ownership of data. Maybe I can ask Lutz to what extent, as an academic representative here, and also potentially, Klaus as a second one, to what extent might ownership of data be an issue with qualifications, bringing together different academic applicants or participants in say a consortium or contributors to a registry? Lutz?
I think the ownership of the data is very important, and I think the patient is the owner of the data. He's sharing it with trusted and clear governance structures. So that has to be include also the secondary use of the data, I think, for this purpose. That has been transparently to be explained, I think, to the patient. I think for us as a registry holder, it was essential that we explained that this is in the public domain. I think the data are coming to the public domain, even if there's a delay. So it's not, as Julian mentioned, I think the data are stored or only shared with the industry, I think. And this guidance is very important to make clear from the beginning, I would say, to get the data in this, not silos, but in this context, I think.
Thank you so much. Klaus, would you like to comment or on this?
Yes, thank you. So absolutely, the owner of the data will always be the participant in any kind of study or registry or research endeavor. Now, there is the function that is served by the data custodian, who has the power to make decisions around the shareability of those data based, of course, on the consent process that was discussed in the previous session. For the purposes of having these kinds of conversations with data custodians and the participants in the research endeavors, one very clear message that we have always heard is that the participants in research want to maximize the power of the data that they contribute. And they don't want to see their data, their contributions, stop with the primary analysis of a single study. And so that's a pretty powerful message for the way in which the value and the utility of the data can and should be maximized. Once you start knowing quite well what kind of context of use you're wanting to qualify, that is going to dictate the kind of analyses that you need to run, and that's going to dictate the kind of data you need. And once you have that triangulation, you want to go after the relevant data sources that can actually support the analysis that would benefit and support the context of use that you're proposing. In the process of doing that, the philosophy that CPAT has always followed is to give the data contributor complete control as to the accessibility of the data that they would like to see as part of an effort. As long as always the data can be presented to regulatory authorities for the purposes of qualification reviews. We have not had a single instance in which the response has been negative, unless, of course, there is major limitant with the consent process, which is a different kind of animal. But from the principal perspective of sharing data, the willingness, especially from the participants in research, is always there. And you can certainly have that be supportive of qualification reviews. I hope that helps clarify.
Jörg, any reaction to this?
Yeah, I would have a question to Klaus. And considering what you just said, would you see it as a possibility that for a qualification exercise, qualification opinion, performance data on a future digital health technology tool could be available as a benchmark for other developments that would build on a similar device, but needs some performance assessment for the tool itself. So the question would be, would you think that the data presented to regulators on device performance could be reused in future scenarios?
Right. No, that's an excellent question. So let me kind of take two avenues to address that question, Gerard. The first part is that for digital health technologies specifically, and especially when you're trying to think of those technologies as potential primary metrics for clinical trials for drugs, you're going to have to think about normative data, not just the performance of the piece of technology and the algorithm on the patients with the condition, but normative data is going to be critical as well. And so how you set up the acquisition of such normative data and the shareability of such normative data could be pretty powerful, so that you don't have to redo the same exercise every single time. That's one component. Now, specifically about the usability of data that supported discussions about devices as medical products, the way we see it is the same way as we see data from drug trials. For several of the solutions, the drug development tools that we have put through EMA's qualification of novel methodologies pathway, we have integrated data from registries, from observational studies, and from drug trials, both the control arms and the active arms. So those data that saw the light of day in a regulatory discussion about an individual medical product, we want to integrate, not for the purpose of revisiting the review of the medical product, but because of the importance that those trial data have for the development of these kinds of drug development tools that can be presented for qualification. So by extension, if you have specific data sets in which a device has been tested in an experimental setting, and those data actually are important to support a specific context of use, absolutely you'd want to be able to integrate those data. But as we have seen, it all depends on the data contribution agreements process, in which you want to give and retain control for the accessibility to those data at the contributor level, so that everything is under control by the contributor of the data, not by anybody else. And I think that is doable, and would be the solution for very specific digital health technology conversations. I hope that answered that question, Jared.
Yeah, thanks. Helpful.
Thank you so much, all. I think that this first topic, although very interesting and quite complex, I guess may have intimidated some of our audience. So we haven't received any questions through Slido, but maybe the next topics will be more engaging. And so maybe going to the second topic, and if I could hand over to my co-chair Paolo. Paolo.
Hi. Okay. So if we can have the next slide, please. Yeah, this one. So here the topic is with regard to the regulatory guidance and early development support. And it's clear, and we heard also mentioned several times during the different sessions that we had before, that there is a need perhaps to provide more support. So here we have two questions. Perhaps the first one, the answer is quite obvious: is there need for more regulatory guidance? But in what form? For which types of methodologies may guidance be missing currently, also looking forward? And perhaps more important, and this is what we heard, for instance, last time from Julian in the previous session, how can improve pre-submission interaction? How far in advance of the actual application submission could this be taking place? So these are the questions that we want to discuss, and we want to hear thoughts about this from you. And okay, as waiting from slide or question, if you have, or comments, suggestions, I would, I see Julian raise his hand. So please, Julian.
Thank you, Paolo. Regarding this topic, and based on my experience as an applicant, when we apply with the registry we created in the Dravet Foundation, the interaction with the EMA was very good. I mean, they really were very supportive, you know what I mean? But they also have some limitations they have to fulfill, you know, and be consistent with the process and the legislation as well, right? So one potential suggestion on this area, it will be that, especially for SMEs, small medium enterprises, or small companies, or academia, and physicians, I mean hospitals with proposals, I mean not non-commercial applicants, the EMA could articulate a specific process, you know, to provide more guidance, you know, at the beginning. Because from my point of view, these groups, the non-commercial groups, they don't have inside the capabilities and the skills to know about the process. You know what I mean? And for example, I know in Spain, the Spanish Medicine Agency has an office in order to provide support for people going to the Spanish agency asking for questions for regulatory processes, right? And they are providing this for free if the applicant is academia or is a small company, right? So similar approach from my point of view, and especially for patient organizations moving into this area, will be very beneficial.
Okay, this is clear and thanks, helpful, and I guess that perhaps also I can understand that some tools could be also more, so to say, because perhaps there are some tools to help SMEs and academia, but perhaps that could be optimized, and also they are not always well known. So this is something that perhaps we could then improve. But I see also Klaus. Please, Klaus.
Yes, thank you, Paulo. And I want to build up on what Julian just mentioned, because the key thing is that historically, regulatory guidance documents are read thoroughly by industry. That's kind of the purpose. So if you are embarking on a qualification of a novel methodology and you have industry stakeholders as part of your group, it's natural for them to understand that the guidance documents need to be very thoroughly understood and reviewed. But when you have other types of stakeholders, and this is not me being negative about the other types of stakeholders, but it's just not in their nature to think about regulatory guidance documents. Other types of stakeholders think about the scientific literature as the main source of any kind of orientation and guidance. That's where you need to work on making sure that the audience for regulatory guidance documents that pertain to topics related to qualification has a broader audience that actually reads up those documents with a lot of intention beyond industry. That could be a way to, even with the guidance documents that are out right now, to get the message out there some more. Now, regarding additional guidance documents and opportunities that we see, I think one of the key pieces is the two-way street that qualification represents, because this is not just about the review of a medical product, in which the regulatory agency has a very defined mission to fill as a steward of public health. When you're talking about new methodologies that will address unmet needs, it's a two-way street in which every party will learn a lot of new things based on the existing data and how to extract maximum value of existing data. So some form of guidance document regarding of how to set up the context of use statement correctly for different types of tools would go a long way. And then also for the two-way street, to make sure that the agency itself thinks about a guidance document that helps the agency itself think through what would be the way to approach the evidentiary requirements depending on specific context of use statements. Because a lot of times the underlying data cannot come from randomized controlled clinical trials, and the thinking needs to be different. A lot of times, depending on the application of the intended context of use, the underlying analyses may be overly complex, and the need to understand that complexity without getting lost into making the perfect the enemy of the good is also a need that we have observed. So that two-way street for guidance documents could go a long way as the agency continues to think about these documents.
Okay, thanks, Klaus, for this comment. Andreas, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you. And I hope this is a good follow-up to what Klaus just said. I think this can be approached from different perspectives, and then the route I would take would first separate in process-related guidance and then, of course, content-related guidance. And I would believe that as regards the guidance that directly pertains to the qualification procedure as such, I think there is good documents in place. Now, looking on the particular aims of a qualification, so what's at the end of a qualification, be it advice, be it opinion, of course, understanding that usually one should lean to the other. I think there's a very diverse set of documents and all addressing particular issues, some at more depth, some at less depth and at different formats. So some are organized as question and answers documents, others are directly spelled out as guidelines, for example, on diagnostic agents. Others are structured as appendices to existing indication-specific guidelines, such as the appendix on PROs to be used in anti-cancer developments. So I think a relevant step would really be to homogenize the guideline landscape and to really set forth some sort of principles. And the question as to which guidance would be suitable, should it be normative, kind of closely falling in tune with the regulatory task, or should it be rather best practice considerations? I think this is indeed a key consideration. And as Klaus said, I mean, there's an abundance of scientific literature available on many of the potential qualification targets, so to speak. And we've heard before that the list of technologies that are concerned is getting more and more diverse. But nonetheless, there's a very rich body of literature available that we could certainly tap into. And to me, and this is a personal preference, I believe that we cannot be too normative in some regards. And this comes back to the question, what in the end should be the result of a qualification? Of course, the use context should always be regulatory use, meaning use of specific methodologies, technologies in registration trials. But there again, there's a spectrum. It's different, for example, if an endpoint were to be used for exploratory studies, if it were to be used to build up a complete package of secondary endpoints, or it were to be used as the primary endpoint in a phase 3 study. So this should inform or could inform at which level such guidance could be formulated. So we could talk about relevant research objectives and performance measures. We could go down one tier and speak about which sources of evidence would be adequate, which we could imagine addressing the questions at hand, and which experimental designs would serve these purposes. Going one step further would mean we formulate success criteria, success thresholds for the specific endpoints or performance measures, which will get very tricky in the end. And this is where I would certainly believe that we're going over the top, coming back to the question, should it be normative or best practice considerations? So saying all this and then speaking about immediate gaps. So I think one of the immediate needs, or one of the most prominent needs, may be that there's a clear and comprehensive spelling out of all the qualification concern methodologies. because in essence, the field has grown over the years. Over time, additional methodologies have entered the field and have undergone the procedure, even though obviously when the procedure was set up, these were not envisioned. And what would also be immediately helpful, I believe, and this pertains to both sides of the table, would be guidance on how to indeed formulate the context of uses in a way that clearly allows sketching a path for which evidence should be generated. And this is a recursive loop in the end, because if such interaction happens early, and for example, the method would then be qualification advice, for example, but then during evidence generation it becomes clear that some of the purported or hoped for context of use may not be attainable based on data generated, we need to come back to the drawing table and see how far such a context of use could still be informed by the data generated. So I think such a recursive loop would certainly benefit from ex ante clearly specifying how to formulate context of use, which context of use are meaningful and can be pursued in the end. And given the fact that this is time sensitive, again, coming back to what you talked about yesterday, early engagement of all parties involved would be important. I think I'll stop here and thank you for the opportunity to contribute.
Thanks, Andreas. Mireille.
Thank you. So I would like actually to build on what Klaus and Andreas just said. The importance of setting the right context of use would be an excellent starting point. We know all that building new guidance is extremely time-consuming and requires a super effort on the side of the regulators, but then also for public consultation. So it is a huge investment. Given the large spectrum of qualifications, it might be probably not the best use of our time. So if having, as Klaus suggested, some basic first context of use, being clear on the need statement as well, and then also providing internal guidance, that would be already a good starting point. And that could be complemented by Q&As or lessons learned from previous qualifications, which are often we don't use all what we have learned in qualification procedures. So that could be already very informative for future qualifications. And then what we have also discussed yesterday, for key topics, it might be really relevant and useful to have workshops to set the scene. If we have new areas for qualification, workshops, as we have learned just in the previous session on registries, have been very extremely useful to have a better, deeper understanding on what is at stake. So these are the few points. And then finally, probably with the public-private consortia being at IMI, IHI, CPAS, to have quite some kind of training modules on so that the applicants have a better understanding of what to expect during a qualification. That might be a few avenues to consider for improving the whole system. Thank you.
Okay, many thanks. Different suggestions on which to reflect on. I really thank you for that. Now I'm looking at some questions from the audience in the slide. And the first one is about this link the qualification to scientific advice, whether it may aid early discussion and allow for consideration alongside the intended use. I see Jordanis, you raised your hand.
If you don't mind, Paolo, I could try to give this a go. So this is a question we are facing quite often. Do we need to come for qualification? Can we come for scientific advice? And we're saying that obviously you don't, qualifications like scientific advice is a voluntary process. You don't need to have, a methodology qualified in order to use it. But of course, the evidence that needs to be generated in order to qualify the methodology is, the same independently of, what avenue you pursue. Scientific advice has a different focus. It's on the drug development. The qualification is on the development of the methodology. And information gleaned from like a development program or on a medicinal product can be used obviously towards building the evidence needed for qualifying the methodology, but it will generally not suffice, or I would think that it would not suffice in order to qualify the methodology. So if the intended purpose is really to use a new methodology, a new, for example, endpoint, for example, in lieu of a regulatory acceptable one, that's not going to be achieved. It will be used. We will say, use it alongside the regulatory acceptable one, for example, in your development program for your drug, but not as a substitute. So it really depends on what ultimately is the the intention. But for sure, it's not mandatory, as we said, to come for qualification. Thank you.
Okay, I see that looking at the time, I guess that since we have 6 topics to discuss, I guess we could move to the next one, and I hand over to Pierre to take the next topic.
Thanks a lot, Paolo. So I believe that the next topic is relatively simple, or it could be answered for many days. You have the choice. No, but okay. Flexibility is always something which is desirable, and when we offer procedures, we normally express some rules for these procedures. This is necessary. This is necessary because we cannot work without any limits. But the limits could be counterproductive in some instances, and the flexibility is always desirable, but to which extent? And this is the question I will ask to the floor there. Do you believe that we could introduce flexibility? And if yes, and probably you will answer yes, on which items could this be introduced? So there are many solutions. We could introduce pre-submission meetings in that could be repetitive. Start the procedure once we have clarified all the possible problems that will be discussed during the procedure. Or we can have longer timelines. We can introduce clock stops. We can have offers for clarifications and so on. So what do you believe that would be sensible to consider? And to answer that question, I would preliminarily give the floor maybe to someone who used the system. Maybe Julian, if you want to answer that from your point of view, because you're experienced.
Oh, wow, thank you. It's a difficult question.
Yes, it could be.
For me, the main problem, as I already explained in the previous session, is the lack of data in most of cases. We don't have enough data. On top of this, because this is a regulatory environment, we have to make sure the data has quality, which is super important, right? Because having a lot of bad data is a bad thing as well, right? So from my point of view, every process or every action oriented to facilitate the acquisition of data will be useful. Any of them. Because the problem I see right now is based on the specific timelines and the specific procedures that we have to follow at the EMA. Sometimes this is an issue, because the applicant doesn't have enough time, taking data takes more time. And my point here is that any process oriented to facilitate that process definitely will help a lot, absolutely, with no questions around.
I understand you now. Adhering to the rules could sometimes be difficult, and any initiative that would facilitate things would be well perceived. I wanted to give you the floor, Klaus. So good that I see that you're requesting it. Please, Klaus.
Yes, thank you, Pierre. So building off of what Julian just mentioned, a couple of things. You would definitely want to make sure that you have an agreed upon feedback from the agency on the context of use statement as the foundation for everything else. And the pre-submission, the pre-meeting mechanism does exist. You can take advantage of that as it exists today to make sure that the context of use is absolutely clear and agreed upon. And if you need to update it, modify it, etc., it's just like with the target profile for a drug. You need to be flexible to accept the fact that you may need to modify the context of use statement, but that those modifications are absolutely agreed upon at the link with what analyses are you going to run, what data are you going to need. That's one component. The other component is that you definitely want to make sure that the agency is okay with the plan you're proposing for the analysis. Scientific advice is a possibility even within the qualification environment. And the agency is always, my experience, willing and able to provide such scientific advice, even in the absence of any results, just to make sure that everything is aligned on the plan. That helps quite a bit. But then once you start running the analyses, one thing that could help, and that I'm not sure it exists today, is the notion of running analyses and presenting the results in a staggered way, so that every piece of result is looked at against the context of use again, and then you inform what next step you're going to run in the analysis, as opposed to waiting for the entire plan of analysis to be completed and then presenting a potentially overly complex dossier back to the agency that may take a long time to review, and that may take more than one meeting to address. That notion of potentially staggered submissions once you have an agreed upon plan could be an option to explore. I'll stop with that.
No, that's very interesting. It rings a bell. I believe you could make a parallel with the prime process. In the prime process, you must know it, we offer some continuous interaction with the applicant to offer some assistance in the development. We may copy that system for the qualification and offer the applicants to come back as soon as they have new ideas or new developments or anything like that, to transform their plans and to help them in being sure that that transformation is still in agreement with the idea we had at the start of the process. So very, very interesting suggestion, Peter.
Okay, I like giving a bit of a regulatory reflection on that. So Pierre and Klaus, thanks for putting us into that direction, because I think it may indeed be a nice kind of similar analogy. But like in Prime, you may also want to understand where you would put your effort, because I mean, it's a little bit working currently like that, because the qualification procedure, if something is really close to, let's say, we would like to qualify, or we feel comfortable with qualifying, there might be this iterative process and it's already happening. But clearly when the data has still to be collected, as you said, Klaus, and then obviously that will take sometimes much longer. And the same applies to the registries. As we discussed, you may want to qualify a registry that has already proven data and collects data like the ECFSPR for 30 years, but you might have something that is newly set up. And when would you feel comfortable qualifying it. So I like the analogy with the prime, and maybe that is something we need to discuss at some stage a little further, is indeed that once you say, well, this looks kind of nice, and we give it a letter of support, perhaps that would be something, an entry point for that interactive type of process. And I think that that's maybe a nice thing to come out of the meeting of today, if that were something we can embrace. I would be in favor of that, at least from what I've heard until now. Thanks.
Yes, indeed. I see Mireille asking for the floor as well. Mireille, please.
Sorry to intervene again, but I absolutely believe that flexibilities in the procedure are really important. But on the other hand, as Nathalie Signoret pointed out yesterday in her presentation, most of the public-private partnerships have defined start and end dates. So predictability is equally important. So the flexibility should not be at the detriment of flexibility, or one needs to work with another. So that's also quite important, because it can be very stressful at the end of a project to finish or not a qualification opinion, and this is to be kept in mind. So really very important also for applicants who don't have that much experience in qualifications, to have some really milestones so that they understand how long it will take. And that can be discussed at the pre-submission meetings, for example.
Yeah, I do agree with you. I believe that flexibility shouldn't become a problem. But my short answer would be flexibility is never mandatory. So it is up to the applicant to ask for flexibility. It is exceptionally the regulators that ask for flexibility. We can regret that sometimes, but it is so. But I believe that the flexibility is more something which could help the applicants, but not to become a problem, for sure. For sure. Jordanis, please.
Yes, thank you, Pierre. Maybe to build a bit even more on Mireille's point, and reflecting a bit on both something that both Klaus mentioned yesterday, but also Cecile mentioned, yesterday. It's important to engage with regulators early, especially when it comes to these projects that have a specific time span. It's important to engage early in order to be able to have predictability as to what is going to happen. Often we see applicants, PPP applicants that are not so familiar, not interpreting necessarily correctly the timelines that they gather or surmise from our public guidance. So it's important to speak to us early in order to be able to have an insight as to what actual time a qualification process may take. And of course, it won't take 3 years. I want to be very clear about that. It's not meant to be that long, and it's rarely actually be in very rare exceptions has it been this long. But there is some time needed, and that's often not interpreted correctly. That said, of course, there's things that we can do in order to improve pre-submission interactions, and I think that especially for the also mentioned quite a few times, for the less regulatorily experienced applicants, like academic applicants or patient organizations, it's important to indeed establish contacts at EMA fairly early on, because obviously on our side we usually think of industry applicants who are very familiar with our processes and our rules and our guidance, and we think that everything is on our website and everything is known to everybody, but that's not necessarily the case for a lot of the applicants. So there's where we can do a lot more to have like a bit of a one-to-one specific support and interaction in order to support these applicants. I will mention, because it was mentioned in the previous session, it was a comment on Slido about about qualifications, and the question was how we were doing a second day of a workshop on qualifications without mentioning how to apply for qualification. And obviously, this is not a training workshop, so this is not meant to teach people how to apply. Of course, the guidance is available, so you could look into it and understand, how to do so. But I guess maybe this is coming again from a less experienced applicant. Unfortunately, the comment was anonymous, so there's no way of knowing who that comment was made by. But it's important indeed to to be able to support these types of applicants with people who can actually direct you to the guidance and kind of take you hand by your hand throughout this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordanis. Klaus, you wanted to come back on some points.
Yeah, just real quick, just to make sure that we take a step back and absolutely ensure that we understand what the end goal of qualification is supposed to be. Why was this pathway created in the first place? It was intended to support the adoption of new methods that solve specific unmet needs in the process. This is not about the individual products. This is about optimizing the process. So if the ultimate goal is to ensure that the qualification industry has the confidence to just apply these new methods without any hesitation that is going to cost them in the review of an individual product if they adopt a new solution, then everything pertaining to the milestones and the real objectives and evidentiary considerations should be viewed under that guise. And what is that drives everything pertaining to those conversations? We've talked about this endlessly today, the context of use statements. So the more we focus on making sure that the entire ecosystem, not just the industry, but also the patient groups and the academicians have, just as everybody has a working understanding of what a biomarker is, we should strive to have a working understanding of on every possible stakeholder as to what a context of use statement is. I'll stop with that.
Okay, I raised my hand about a really short comment because I had some sympathy in what you said about flexibility, and when you mentioned the prime, and of course some way of prioritizing could be imagining in that, perhaps taking into account the maturity. I just would say that I very much liked when I heard it was perhaps Cecile yesterday mentioning the fact that one should engage to have an upfront strategy and key regulatory milestones, and that's where I think that we should try to perhaps to imagine and build something where we could, in this context, agree when it is reasonable in a reasonable time frame to get and reach this milestone that are agreed. This is a process that could be in a way envisaged. But now I stop here because I see questions, and I think it's better to leave the floor to audience. Thanks.
Yes, I see some questions on the relationship between ITF and qualification processes. I would say that this is not necessarily superimposable. There could be some processes that could be common to ITF and to qualification processes, but not all the questions would go to both processes. There are differences. In any instance, I believe that the colleagues at the EMA could be very happy to offer assistance to select the best pathway to go for an easier, smoother, and quicker assessment of the questions. But I'm speaking here under the control of the colleagues from the EMA, but I would say that the simple answer is that if in some instances the ITF is the best solution, or if the qualification is the best solution, please discuss with us as early as you want, and we will select together the best solution. I see a comment. It would be very helpful if an easy process for follow-up questions could be established. Yes, indeed, but it is exactly the question we had. We are offering flexibility, and flexibility means that we could come back on some points and we could have follow-up questions and so on. So this is exactly what we are discussing. Yes, I think. But if colleagues want to comment on those questions quickly, because I believe that we are close to the end of this topic. Yes, Jordanis, I was expecting you.
Thank you, Pierre. On the issue of ITF, I would say that actually ITF is very nicely placed, for an early interaction. I mean, obviously we're talking about qualification of novel methodologies. The innovation aspect is there, so that falls nicely within the scope of ITF. And effectively, I think that the types of experts, network experts that ITF colleagues would turn to would be pretty much the same or similar or overlapping to the types of experts that would like to recruit into a qualification team. The ITF meeting also offers much more temporal flexibility. Usually pre-submission interactions for an upcoming qualification are temporarily linked to the upcoming submission, so it's quite kind of late, or the applicant should be almost ready to submit. ITF doesn't have that temporal limitation, so I think it's actually a good use of the ITF meetings, and maybe this is something that in our qualification guidance we should highlight more and build on that relationship with ITF more. Now, in terms of the follow-up questions, I would think that it really depends on the nature of the follow-up questions. Certain questions are clarifications only, and therefore actually we are addressing them via clarification. Sometimes there's questions that it really is a matter of keeping the dialogue open, and these are actually the cases where we would consider going for a second list of issues and a second discussion meeting with implications, of course, on the finalization. Other times the feedback from regulators is such that the applicant needs to go back and do substantial homework before coming back, and in those cases obviously only like a follow-up procedure in due time would be the only pragmatic way forward. So it really depends on the follow-up questions, but we are trying to maintain that flexibility. Thank you. And I guess maybe it's time to move on to our next topic.
Exactly. And thanks for the participants. I believe we had nice ideas during that session. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we come to a question which is about actually patient involvement in qualifications. Okay, and here's the slide. And it's true that patient representatives are not that commonly involved in qualification procedures. It's usually in relation to qualification of patient-reported outcomes that would not just welcome, but actually very actively seek the contribution of patients. But also in more recent times, these digital technologies, where the patient involvement is much more intense. We're talking about wearables, we're talking about all kinds of things that have implications for patients and their daily life. This is where we are usually asking for patient involvement. So our patient representative on the panel, so Julian, you're on the spot again. We would like to hear your views as to how patient involvement could and input into the qualification procedure be improved. Okay, and let's be clear, we're not talking about here about the development of the methodology. We're talking about involvement of the patient representative in the actual regulatory assessment procedure, which is obviously a different step of the process, and obviously needs to be to maintain all the requirements of independence of opinion. And the other closely related question, we also have been discussing this with industry applicants in scientific advice, to what extent patient specific questions could be included into the briefing documents that would aim to elicit patient-specific, input. Of course, the patient would still be welcome to provide any comments or general comments on any aspect of the qualification, because in certain cases we have patient representatives that are not so familiar with regulatory, but others are much more familiar. So Julian, for example, would be like a very obviously experienced patient representative, but there are often patient representatives that will sometimes feel intimidated because of the technical language and discussion, especially in qualification. So Julian, the floor to you to give us your input on these questions.
Yeah, thank you. And this is a very interesting question because, as you already mentioned, we have official patient representatives in different committees, in CAT, PDCO, COMP, but we don't have an official process to be involved in qualification, right? Maybe one suggestion would be to articulate that process. The challenge, as you already anticipated, is the lack of knowledge, the potential lack of knowledge for the process, because it could be very, very complicated. But it's something we can mitigate or we can solve, because European patient organizations like Eurordis is organizing every year a training for patients. And this training program has a lot of information about regulatory process. And maybe it will be interesting to put a little bit of more focus on the qualification procedure to make sure the patients who has been trained by the patient organizations, they are familiar with the process. This will be a possibility. Probably Eurordis will be interesting to learn more about this potential option. For me, this is the main obstacle, right? Is to make sure the patient is familiar with the process and the patient understands the importance of the information they have to provide and the data they have to provide as well, because sometimes the patient can be asked about data, so particular information. But definitely, this is something the patient organizations are asking for. Absolutely, be involved in the procedure, and also a general comment to the patient organization and the patients as well is because sometimes the industry especially is asking patients to be involved in the procedure as well from the industry side, which is okay. You know what I mean? It's okay, but sometimes it's much more better, to be in the middle, to be an external expert. You know what I mean? Because when you're an external expert, you can demonstrate that you don't have a conflict of interest with the industry, and your feedback will be perceived in a much more better way, from my point of view. So a general comment to patients being called by companies to participate in the procedures is, it's okay, you know what I mean? But consider also to contact the EMA, especially the patient engagement organization in the EMA is very powerful and very useful, and they will be happy to support you in order to check if this is okay and is any other better way to be involved in the procedure. Because from my experience, being involved in qualification is very useful. You can provide a lot of information, and the experts, they always recognize the patient voice, always. So my experience, and because I've been also participating in several qualification procedures, has been super positive. I hear, or I feel that people is listening to us. So don't be afraid and try to be engaged. Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Julian. Maybe a follow-up specific question. Do you think for the less experienced, so to speak, patient representatives having like these specific questions for the patient phrased, in order to address the patient, not necessarily, the regulators, is something that might help or not necessarily?
But one suggestion, because I just remember one thing that we are doing at the COMP that can be shared and can be very, very useful is sometimes we are 3 patient representatives at the COMP, but sometimes we don't have the expertise for the particular condition, right? So we call an external expert to come, and one of the patient representatives, the official ones, we are like the mentors for this patient. We facilitate the conversation, and we are some kind of translators between the regulatory needs and the information what is needed from the patient. You know what I mean? So, for example, this type of setup could be something to explore. You know what I mean? You guys can use one of the patient representatives, but we are in the different committees because we are supposed to have the knowledge on the regulatory process, and we can work together with the real patient expert, you know, and make sure that we are helping that patient to be attached to the regulatory framework.
Thank you so much. And just to reassure that obviously, both in qualifications, but also in scientific advice, in case of patient representative involvement, the scientific officer has like a very active role in reaching out to the patient representative, explaining, you know, the process, explaining the content, you know, acting as you say, like not necessarily as a mentor, but, you know, in order to explain how things work and easing, you know, whatever concerns and helping the patient representative focus if that's really, you know, an issue, you know, in case the patient you know, feels overwhelmed with the information that they're receiving. But thank you very much, Julian, again for your contributions. And Klaus, you want to come in on this topic?
Yeah, just real quick and amplify on what Julian just mentioned. So because we're a nonprofit and because we operate in the qualification world exclusively, we don't do products themselves. For those qualification meetings and scientific advice meetings that pertain to very specific solutions to the process, we always tend to prefer to have a patient representative always as part of the conversation. Because we are a neutral convener and we're a nonprofit, we can make that happen easily, to Julian's point about you know, the optics of the participation. But I do recall one interaction in which actually the agency had invited a patient expert, and we had a fantastic discussion about the clinically meaningful aspects of the solution at hand was addressing as part of optimizing the process. So trying to have, again, that two-way street of patient representation at the agency and patient representation with applicants is a good thing to do. And I would just strongly support that. I'll stop with that.
Thank you so much, Klaus. And Mireille, you want to come in as well?
Also very quickly, so based on the experience I have from the EMA Prefer qualification, we had qualification. We had patients as part of our applicants team involved right from the beginning of the procedure. But it would have been even better to have also patients part of the qualification team. So we had developed a patient-friendly briefing book, but unfortunately, ex-consortia, we didn't have that much of substantial input from other patient associations, the discussion. So probably also a problem or a way for improvement in having some training modules on the qualification procedure. That could be something to be considered. The patient training element is really great to have more active patient engagement in the discussion. So, and eventually we could also envisage to have patients and consumer working parties involved as pertinent. Not all topics are equally well, or might be less or more or less interesting from a patient's perspective. So that's in a nutshell what I would like, and also having transparency on how patients have been involved in the qualification opinion, for example, could be also avenues to be considered. Thank you.
Thank you, Mireille. Very nice points. I have to say that indeed, you know, reflecting the patient input into the final kind of advice or qualification opinion is not, because it's supposed to be in the end like a CHMP advice, CHMP opinion, not like individual people's. So it's not always like evident, or it's not always, it's actually not evident, how the patient input is incorporated. But we also have been running analysis, and there's been a recent publication from last year about the patient input into qualification. Maybe not something that we can kind of formally reflect in the outcomes, but definitely something that we keep track on, and our colleagues engaging with patient representatives and healthcare professionals very active in actually not just ensuring or helping us identify relevant patient representatives, but also eliciting input from both the patient representative, but also at least the EMA scientific officer as to how useful the involvement and the contribution of the patient representative has been. So, but very, very thanks for the for your comments. Peter, you want to come in as well?
Yeah, thanks. So this turns out to be a very interesting discussion, and I think the Prefer project, I'm somewhat aware of that, obviously, was really interesting in the sense that it also tried to describe at some stages where patients were not just the part in the preference studies that you perform, but also in the designing part. And I was triggered by Julian earlier, who said in our session on the registries that patients should not be on the center of the focus, but they should actually be really participating in the whole project. So I believe that is an important aspect to take on board. And I know that there are all the kind of ways of trying to get patients' input, and sometimes it's very good. And I agree with Jordanis, there's a lot of effort put there. But sometimes it could obviously be more. And in my mind, it could be also tied to a little bit to the consultation that we do afterwards. And that is maybe also leading into your next discussion, Jordanis, but how we communicate about what we qualify, and how could that become also more of interest to the patient, also or patient organizations to respond to this. Would there be any views, maybe Mireille you could give, but also Julian or Elizabeth, if you're still around, on how this could be best done? Because I think that would be very good if we make at least clear what we qualify, and that we also get really input on, okay, what does this now translate into for a patient?
Thank you, Peter. And I'm not sure if we should answer this question directly or whether we should actually go to thank you. Hand over to Paolo now for the next topic, which is really about, the outcome of qualification procedures, and how exactly, how well, or, we're communicating that, and what could be done to improve such communication. So Paolo, over to you.
Okay, thanks. But it's nice to start with this link. And of course, I can only agree on the fact that the earlier the patient is involved, the better it is. It is simple, but what is happening more often is that the patient is involved at the time of the qualification opinion, and then if they do not agree, well, how this is taken into account, it's not always so strong, so to say. But anyway, on this point, which also could be relevant, this is about the qualification outcome format and perhaps communication, because we heard many times during this workshop also on the fact that we should perhaps better communicate, and so this is the opportunity to discuss this issue. It's clear that the briefing document and the EMA format needs some standardization, and the regulatory guidance and presentation require improvement. But the question to the panelists and to is that what other means of communicating qualification opinions and advertising letter of support should be employed in order to increase the reach and impact on qualification opinions and better support qualifications in development. So this is a very interesting question. I guess that there perhaps we have some room for improvement, and hearing the discussion, in the previous session. I believe it's so. On this, I would like to ask Mireille, which I see here, to provide some comment. Mireille?
Yeah, thank you. So regarding the outcome formats, to have or at least a roughly common outcome format would help to have a smooth sharing of regulatory information on biomarkers, methods, or standards, and that should allow to easily retrieve and search for example, context of use information. And this structured data, while waiting, as Julian mentioned, on OpenAI, we have still to rely on structured data. That would be facilitate the analysis and enable further research on how qualified tools have been used, for example, in regulatory decision making. This regulatory uptake that could be measured, or in how qualified tools have been used in clinical trials, how they have been used for patents, exactly what Anna tried to illustrate in session 1. Regarding the communication, I mentioned the workshops already, so I will not repeat that, but to accompany the qualification opinion, it might be useful to have a Q&A for the public to help to increase the understanding on what the qualification opinion is about, in a similar way that you have for marketing authorization products, so that the people have some understanding how regulatory decision making is made, what has been considered, and that would increase trust and confidence in the regulatory review system. And then finally, also connecting with learned societies, for example, in diseases, with healthcare professional associations, there are clinical guidance. Here we could have also better integration of qualified tools in their guidance. So that's quite important. As I mentioned, I really believe in having a close connection to the public-private partnerships that maximizes impact. And EMA has done already a good job in writing scientific articles on qualifications, and they should continue to do so, because that helps to have a better understanding on how qualified tools are being used in real life. So that's, in a nutshell, very succinctly summarized the few ideas I had.
I appreciate what Mireille explained on communication strategies, and I agree that that can be improved. And also the question already implies that the presentation of qualification opinions and letters of support may be improved. And I think EMA might better advertise this. But I would want to come to the content part of, I think we have to admit that there was some progress since qualification procedures were implemented, and there is some variability in the format of qualification opinions, and also with regard to letters of support, the content varies. And I would, for the future, want to improve on the format of qualification opinions in a way that this should be very much centered around the context of use. And I think we need to better explain the considerations that led to this context of use, and also restrictions. And finally, this
should then enable the application of these opinions in drug development by as many interested parties as possible. And I think Klaus nicely explained that this all centers around an appropriate context of use description. And if we can improve on this, an important step would also already be done. I think the question mentions only qualification opinion and lists of issues. I think we may also think about communicating on content of qualification advices on a high level that come through our qualification procedure, because this would also indicate where developments are undertaken. And I think also this question connects to the next question about life cycle management. And I think as many of the information parts currently available are static, we may need to improve and make this potentially dynamic, because tools and qualification opinions might evolve in future. Thanks.
Now, thanks for these comments, Jürgen. Thanks also for mentioning that this perhaps should not be restricted to opinions and letter of support, but some thoughts in terms of transparency, at least, or in terms of context as used there, and also whether this might be helpful in so to say, pre-competitive collaboration is a thought that might be done. Klaus, I see your hand.
Thank you, Paolo. And so, two things that relate to the question that is on the slide. First one, I think it ties to the start of the conversation about the context of use statement and the guidance documentation. I think it would be quite impactful for a consideration to be put around the level of impact that a proposed context of use has in decision-making for drug development. What I mean by that is this. Yes, we have a clear understanding of the context of use depending on the application of a solution in the drug development process and depending on the nature of the population being applied to, and all those things that make up a well-structured context of use statement. But because the context of use statement describes a solution to an unmet need in the process, what kind of decision-making does that context of use support? And the level of the decision could be viewed into different categories. Some categories in which the level of the decision is of an impact that could be highest if you're talking about potentially labeling claims, or it could be of way lower impact if you are thinking about, for example, optimizing the way you select patients to participate in trials, and then things in between those two ranges. Some form of discussion and guidance on the level of evidence that is required depending on the type of impact that a proposed context of use has, I think could go a long way. And if that could be put into some kind of a guidance document, that would be fantastic. That's number one. But then number two, specifically about how that relates to this question, how can we ensure that the qualifications and the letters of support actually do have the necessary impact that we intend them to have? Number one, the agency could have a major amount of protagonism here to make things happen in terms of, as part of, once a qualification is reached or a letter of support is issued, once that happens, then what kind of product reviews happen after that, and for which ones of those reviews has a tool that has received a letter of support or a qualification opinion being used. I think the agency could start thinking about how to document that. Not necessarily the details as to how it was used, or if there's, sensitivity components around the specific medical product, but at least qualitatively that the tool was actually used, and that it was used to inform specific decisions that mattered to that program, and start cataloging those. I think that could go a long way in making sure that we better understand the impact. And then another thing that could also be considered is the aspect of how to put that discussion around the use of a qualified or a tool that has received a letter of support, how that was viewed in the regulatory review process of a medical product, and how to put that in the documentation that ends up becoming publicly available, that the EMA has mechanisms to make publicly available as part of regulatory reviews of products. Those three things could go a long way. I'll stop with that.
Okay, I thanks for this comment, and in a sense, you say that the impact of the context of use may require a different standards and evidence generation requirement. This is what you mean. It's something that is very interesting, of course, and in a sense also related to the concept of the unmet need or the fact that this is very interesting. Thanks for putting forward. And let me check whether there are comments from the other colleagues on this last point that has been made. Thoughts on that? And in the meanwhile, I see that a question on the slide, or let me read, was published. Yes, I don't know whether Jordanis, you want to comment on this one, and perhaps the way opinions are presented might be optimized, and this is something, of course, that could be thought.
Absolutely. Thank you, Paolo. Indeed, this is actually like a very nice, suggestion in the sense that indeed opinions and letters of support are simply published chronologically. So it's often difficult to navigate, especially after. I mean, of course, it's a matter of volume. Until now, maybe we didn't have that problem. We didn't have that many things published, but now the numbers or the queue is getting longer. So it's difficult to sometimes identify if you're looking for something specific. So it would be indeed actually a very good idea to try to classify, differently based on the type of method based, or maybe use some keywords, some tags, to each opinion to say that this is, I don't know, digital, this is biomarker, this is, I don't know, COA, and so on and so forth, or, by different, disease areas. So this is indeed some of the things that we're thinking. Coming back also to Klaus's, point, I think that indeed it would be very, and this is something that we can eventually incorporate into, briefing document templates, towards, the final, qualification of opinion. Indeed, what could be the impact, or how we could, we as regulators could see the, the context of use or the evolution of the methodology in the future, but also, currently, what the impact would be of that qualified, methodology. Absolutely. Thank you, Klaus.
Okay, do not see further comments or hands raised. So I guess that we could move to the next topic.
Okay, so the last topic is a bit problematic. Once we released a letter of support less of a problem, or an opinion, a bit more tricky, we must face the fact that things can change, the disease can change, the methods can change, anything can be modified. So if the opinion becomes useless, it's not a problem because we will simply stop using it. The problem is that sometimes outdated methods, because being supported by an opinion, could have the toxic effect of preventing better methods, more adapted to the state of the art, to be in place, and this is a problem. So we must adapt our opinions mainly to what could change, and there must be a process in that. We must be creative here. It was not a problem, but now we may have relatively old opinions that could deserve some modification, some adaptation, some comments, and we should offer evolutivity that could adapt the things. So I believe this is a question that I would ask at the first step to the colleagues from the regulatory side, which means Jörg or Andreas or Peter. Who wants to comment on that? Yes, Peter.
So thanks, Pierre. Yeah, I think we addressed the topic a bit earlier today in the afternoon, also in the registry session. Clearly, the life cycle management came up. I think the important one is obviously what I think also Lutz said, that once you're getting qualified, you're getting indeed approached by different companies, and sometimes also beforehand already on, well, what your registry can do and if they can collect data there. The discussion that he then described was also that at that stage we miss then the contact as a registry owner with the regulator. So partly of this lifecycle management could maybe be simply be updated in just the context of PAS and PAS, or the efficacy and the safety studies after approval, where we would build in some way of also interacting with the registry, whether the data can be there, maybe talk about feasibility of the studies. And in that sense, by doing it, by the proof of the pudding is in eating it, having a sort of update of the registry. What does that then mean if the registry doesn't get any studies that are being submitted to the regulator? Do we then need to take action? Yeah, that could be a point of discussion. Is that necessary? Well, that will depend a little bit on how many registries ultimately will end up qualified. Maybe the list will for sure be longer on the NCEP side, where you at least by yourself describe your registry. So in that sense, it is important that the life cycle is sort of kept, that we have that additional discussion. Whether that does per se mean that we need to re-qualify a registry or put something there on the, let's say, the website of the qualification procedures, maybe not, because you would engage those registries probably through the product-related applications. But that could be a view, and I'm not sure if that is the comprehensive view, but it would be my response at this stage.
No, thanks for that. It's very important. And I see there, personally, a difference between registries and methods, because a registry is by nature something that will change over time, because you're adding new patients and the patients already included may have different outcomes. And this could result in the field changing, not because the external field is changing, but because the thing you qualified changes, which is important. For the methods, we would expect that the methods, once validated and supported, will not change dramatically, but the environment, not only technical, but pathophysiological, could change and make the methods no longer applicable or not entirely applicable or amenable to modifications. I see Klaus and then Lutz asking for the floor. So Klaus, please.
Thank you, Pierre. So two components to answering this question about the life cycle. One thing is to always keep the unmet need in mind. And if there's a qualification opinion for a solution that addresses an unmet need, back to the previous question, what is the impact? Has that unmet need truly been addressed? If it has, fantastic. There are a plethora of unmet needs that could be solved. If a proposed solution to an unmet need might be familiar to something that has been already qualified, that should kind of point to the fact that maybe the unmet need has not been fully addressed, which is totally fine. And the consideration can be made about additional tools that help further address the unmet need. One key metric that could be progressively introduced into all these conversations is pertaining to how the context of use relates to the unmet need and what is the remaining uncertainty. And say, well, it's remaining uncertain will never go down to zero, but what is it? And put a pin on that. And if a new solution comes along that actually shrinks that remaining uncertainty even further, fantastic. And if it continuously reduces that, then you know when you're reaching the territory of diminishing returns, number one. But then number two, you're also able to not just stifle innovation because you have qualified something. It becomes an incentive to further shrink down that remaining uncertainty. Those were the two things that I wanted to introduce. Thank you.
Very useful. Welcome. I believe it builds the further discussions. Okay, Lutz, please, and then I have Andreas, but Lutz first.
I think it's very important to keep on in the discussion or dialogue, at least, I think, because, for example, patient-reported outcome, the value of the meaningful difference can change with new medications to treat the baseline disease some 10 years ago. And there was a question on Slido on giving advice on the best patient-reported outcome, which might be feasible and acceptable also. That's a very important part. And also, I think from a registry, I think the input on data quality and also on the questions, I think, which variables might be of interest. I think the discussion about from pregnancies, but also from safety standards are very important to trigger developments in the registries. So I would say a regular dialogue, and at least after 3 years would be very important. And then I think also the connection, I think, with the impact and the uptake of the methods is very important to really connect to the qualification opinion, to really see and easily see how the method is used. I think for registries might be more easier in the answer, but as a data source, but for others like patient-reported outcome, it's much more difficult to see how it's uptaken and what is the decision here.
Yeah, yes, indeed. All these points are important. Andreas.
Yeah, just very briefly to the first two bullets here. I think I have some reservations as to measuring the impact and uptake of qualified methodologies, simply because there is a very limited handling to, again, initially the motives why applicants come for qualification, and then, of course, in how far this is tailored for specific development or indeed broadly developed. It's not so much of importance whether this is in the end public information, meaning that everybody should in principle be capable of picking up the qualified procedure, but rather was it indeed developed with broad use in mind? So I really struggle with thinking about the denominator of any such quantification of what uptake means, and indeed, was it large, was it low, compared to which expectations even? So I'm a bit struggling with the idea of indeed putting impact and uptake into numbers, also because even though the process has seen a number of procedures over the years, the set is very fragmented, meaning that for meaningful comparisons, I do believe that we're still struggling from small samples in many regards. And on the second point of the extension of the context of use, I mean, this is indeed an important aspect that we oftentimes see also in regular advice. So if something has been developed for a specific indication with large phenotypical overlap with related indications, it's very obvious, especially in rare disease, that some parallels are immediately drawn by developers asking, well, given that there is large phenotypical overlap between disease A and disease B, would you agree that, given that you have accepted use of this tool in disease A, that we use it in disease B? So I think we have seen a number of such requests, and indeed the discussion should be had that this would also best be channeled through qualification indeed. I think we could indeed think about setting up some sort of bridging exercise, and indeed this could formulate, let's say, some sort of experiments that would be needed, or some sort of discussion that could be had about essential similarities. So I think this may indeed be a very elegant way to broaden use and broaden the impact and uptake in the end, if we indeed think early on about potential parallels between use cases. So even though, again, it's very important, as said before, to clearly be specific about the context of use, from a strategic perspective, from a clinical perspective, some breadth may be desirable. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas. I take your points, and one which is interesting is that things could be predictable in many instances. When we start something, we have an idea on how much what we are giving an opinion about could be sensitive to changes, and whether the opinion is solid or not. And we could, in advance, have some plans for modifying, adapting, reviewing, criticizing, and so on, as soon as necessary, something we gave an opinion on, which is very important, and that should be an important part of the opinion or of anything we release. Mireille, please.
So I wanted to elaborate on the extension of context of use. I believe this would be really an excellent starting point for smaller consortia, for example, or to really build, and we can really learn from each other in really improving what is already qualified, and to expand the use. This is the case for biomarkers, for example, where you can use the context of use initially might be relatively narrow, but once you gain experience in using it, and I believe that was also demonstrated in one of the papers published on biomarkers, if I recall correctly. I don't remember which of the two it was, but you could see that the biomarkers that were qualified have been used actually outside of their initial context of use. So here we could adapt the procedural timelines, for example, because the effort might be less. You can really have a life cycle management like you would have with variations and adding to it, and this would come then with reduced timelines and eventually reduced fees. The review effort is not the same. So that could be help to leverage data sets that were generated initially and really learn from each other.
Thanks, Mireille. This is in accordance with something we touched upon during the preliminary discussion before the workshop here. We discussed with Thorsten, with Michael, with Paolo. We discussed the idea of having the qualification not being only a linear process, starting from an ID, going to that ID, and not changing anymore, not being extended. And instead of being linear, we could have some ideas on how things could be taken by other stakeholders, by the same stakeholder, but for another use of what we've validated, and to build on what has been accepted or already given an opinion on, and have it changed over time according to the needs and even new needs that were not there at the time of the initial qualification. But this is something where we should be creative. I completely support that view. Klaus, please.
Okay, so to me, it all goes back to the proposed solution always needing to address an unmet need, and that's the cornerstone of the setup of a context of use and then a qualification procedure. So, to me, it's not so much the question of, oh, has this tool been used X amount of times, or the denominator problem that Andreas just articulated. To me, it's about, has the unmet need been solved? Meaning, if the intended solution was designed to optimize trial design, then let's look at the design of the trials. Has the trial design paradigm in that therapeutic area truly have been transformed? If it has, the unmet need has been solved. If people were struggling with how to select patients for a specific type of trial for a specific challenging indication, if after the qualification opinion is issued or the letter of support is issued, that paradigm changes and that no longer becomes an issue, that's what you want to achieve. And I think some kind of metric structure that looks into how those unmet needs are met is a good way to start without having to worry about the, how many have actually adopted a solution, because adoption itself, like calling it, I used it, is fine, but it doesn't really get to the heart of the philosophy of qualification, which was intended to, again, put a stamp on novel methodologies that could actually address unmet needs in the drug development process. So I'll stop with that.
No, thanks for that. I believe it's really true. Maybe some comments on the fact that in some instances we may approve or recommend or support something, and because this is labeled as the method for exploring something, it will be the preferred method by people wanting to develop in the concerned area. And it would block some better initiatives to get exactly the same results, but with better methods or so on. So it would be a paradoxical effect of validating something that would prevent from validating something else. What would be the possibility for preventing that phenomenon? We haven't observed yet, but is it a real problem, or is it only in my head? Klaus.
Well, I can answer from my perspective. Again, what is the remaining uncertainty, and have you actually addressed an unmet need? Because if you have, that's fantastic. But if the unmet need is still there, that means that the remaining uncertainty, even if it got not shrunk to a place where it is actually impactful. That's one thing. Now, the other thing is this. Every time there is a scientific advice discussion for a potential novel methodology in one area, the learnings from that scientific advice have ramifications beyond that specific area. Mm. And we have examples in which the solutions that were built for Alzheimer's first ended up influencing how solutions for polycystic kidney disease, even tuberculosis, were informed. Completely different indications with completely different biology, completely different products, but the nature of the unmet need that those areas had was not too dissimilar. And so the nature of that, some of the aspects of the nature of the solutions were or had some common denominators. Now, of course, everything else changed according to the specific disease, the nature of the indication, the nature of the types of products being thought of for those kinds of diseases. but the cross learnings were always there. And so another method of understanding how from one qualification learnings happen in another unmet need in another area and how that gets informed is also a tangible measurement of impact. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks a lot. I see that we are coming close to the end of the discussion, so I do not see anything on the Slido, but would anyone want to express a last comment? Jordanis.
Yes, actually, Pierre, we do have here is we got a comment on Slido about non-clinical 3Rs models. That there should be flexibility in the context of use and broad applicability, as the goal in that case is reduction of animal use. So on this, I would say that also in the EMA regulatory science strategy to 2025, there is a specific mention about 3R models and an invitation for such methodologies to come for qualification, because indeed this would be greatly supported. Of course, it remains to be seen. We have to actually review such methodologies in order to be able to say how easy or difficult it may be to qualify them. We lack experience in that respect, but we would certainly welcome this.
Sure. So I think you nicely addressed the question, Slido. Falk wanted to intervene now.
Yeah, thank you, Pierre. But I think the question is now on the screen. So I heard from Klaus that he suggests we should address unmet medical need, but the question is really how to measure this in a reasonable manner, and not to forget that there are quite a number of qualifications coming through. So how do they do that, for example, at critical path? Or if there's suggestions from the audiences, that would be very interesting to hear.
Peter.
Well, I think the obvious people to ask are also the colleagues from the IHI who are on the call. But I would believe that we can easily do something like a search for impact in publications and clearly in registrations of products. But I think especially in scientific publications that surround, let's say, the developments would be a possibility.
Yes, and I believe we are in a good place to measure the impact, because we are the place where scientific advice procedures come, and even sometimes before publication, before marketing authorization or anything, we have as regulators an idea on how much new methods could be used or could be offered to be used, and this is another place where we could measure the impact. So I think we are in the right seat to do that. Okay, so was it the last point we had? I think so. So let's go back to the final discussion, and maybe let's close the meeting after that. And thanks a lot for the discussion once more.
Yeah, thanks, Pierre. Yeah, I guess that we now come to the end of this meeting. So first of all, let me thank all those who contributed. Starting from the co-chair of this workshop, Thorsten Wette, for the enormous and the invaluable effort done in the preparation of this event, really. Then chairs, speakers, panelists, and all those who attended and came forward with very interesting questions, thoughts to stimulate discussion and further reflections from us. We heard many important suggestions on the importance and possible ways to foster pre-competitive collaboration, increasing awareness and transparency, to optimizing support and regulatory guidance, especially, but not exclusively for SMEs and patients' organization. And let me say that I very much like the Julian's statement on patient not just being in the centers surrounded by regulators, industry, and physicians, but dancing with them And I very much like that image. Thanks for giving us this. And also we discussed how improving the qualification process, considering flexibilities. We heard about the need of exploring ways to offer multi-stakeholder advice, the one-stop shop concept, notified bodies, HTA, something on which we might willing to reflect. And in general, the importance of involving experts, also taking into account the evolving landscape and the evolving complexity. And also, then we discussed how to improving the uptake and the impact of qualification and improving visibility, communications, and we had much room for improvement there, and link it to this. We touched upon the importance of life cycle management, which also is relevant. So many thoughts that we're going to digest soon after the workshop. Let me remind you that a survey will be sent out post-meeting to all stakeholders for further input, and really we want to collect as many views as this is possible. So I guess that it was the last thing from my side. So again, many thanks to all. Have a nice evening to everyone.